The end of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, once a mighty force, stretched across vast lands, from the sun-drenched coasts of Hispania to the frozen steppes of the northernmost reaches of Britain. It was the beating heart of the ancient world, its laws, roads, and architecture shaping civilization as we know it. But even the most formidable empire can falter, and in the 5th century, the unimaginable occurred. Rome, the eternal city, fell. The collapse of Rome didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, grueling process, like the unraveling of a complex tapestry, thread by thread. Historians often point to the year 476 CE as the symbolic end of the Western Roman Empire, when the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer. But this was not a single, dramatic event. Instead, it was the final blow in a series of challenges that had been weakening Rome for centuries. What led to the fall of Rome? In many ways, it was a confluence of internal weaknesses and external pressures. From within, the empire faced economic struggles, corruption, and political instability. The once efficient Roman economy had begun to collapse under the weight of overexpansion and crippling taxes. The empire's vast borders stretched thin, with military resources spread too far to maintain control. These issues were further compounded by the empire's internal divisions. Constant infighting among Roman emperors and generals made it impossible to create a unified front against the growing threats outside. Externally, the pressure was mounting from numerous barbarian groups pushing against Rome's borders. From the Visigoths to the Vandals, the Huns to the Franks, these tribes were not simply raiders, but also migrants seeking new lands and opportunities. In 410 CE, the Visigoths, led by Alaric, made history when they sacked Rome, the first time in over 800 years that the city had fallen to an enemy. It was a symbolic moment, marking the weakening of Rome's power and influence. But it wasn't just the loss of territory or the fall of the city itself that signaled Rome's demise. The collapse of the Roman military, once considered the greatest fighting force in the world, was another key factor. As Rome faced mounting invasions, its once formidable legions were stretched thin, replaced by mercenary forces who had little loyalty to the empire. Over time, these mercenaries were less and less able to defend the empire's borders effectively, leading to a steady erosion of Roman territory. In the final years of the Western Roman Empire, the city of Rome itself became less of a political and military center and more of a symbolic one. While the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, would continue to thrive for several more centuries, the fall of Rome marked a profound shift in the history of Europe. The lights of Roman civilization began to dim, and Europe plunged into a period of turmoil and transformation known as the Dark Ages. As the western half of the empire collapsed, the power vacuum left behind was filled by a mix of barbarian kingdoms and local rulers, each vying for control of the former Roman territories. The rich intellectual and cultural legacy of Rome began to fade, and much of the knowledge of the ancient world would be lost or forgotten for centuries. But amid the chaos, the seeds of the new Europe were planted, seeds that would eventually lead to the rise of feudalism, the spread of Christianity, and the emergence of powerful medieval monarchies. The fall of Rome wasn't the end of European history, it was the beginning of a new chapter. The stories of the people who survived, rebuilt, and adapted to the changing world around them would lay the foundations for the Europe we know today. The rise of barbarian kingdoms. As the dust settled on the crumbling remains of the Western Roman Empire, the stage was set for a new order, one that would emerge from the ashes of a once great civilization. The power vacuum left by the fall of Rome did not lead to a return of peace or stability. Instead, it gave rise to a new wave of rulers, the barbarian kingdoms. These were the peoples whom the Romans had long considered and civilized: the Visigoths, Vandals, Ostrogoths, Franks, and others who would now carve out their own realms in the heart of Europe. The term barbarian was coined by the Romans, and it was often used dismissively to describe any people who were not part of the sophisticated Roman world. However, after the fall of Rome, many of these so-called barbarians would go on to form the foundations of medieval Europe. The Visigoths, led by the warrior King Alaric, were one of the first groups to make their mark. In 410 CE, they famously sacked Rome, an event that sent shockwaves throughout the empire. Though they were not able to fully destroy the city, their victory marked the beginning of the end for Roman dominance in the West. In the years that followed, various barbarian groups began to establish their own kingdoms in former Roman territories. The Vandals, having sacked Rome in 455 CE, established a kingdom in North Africa, while the Ostrogoths, under their leader Theodoric the Great, claimed Italy. The Franks, one of the most successful barbarian groups, established a powerful kingdom in what is now modern-day France and Germany. Led by Clovis, the first king of the Franks, they would go on to form the Merovingian dynasty, which would later evolve into the Carolingian Empire under Charlemagne. These barbarian kingdoms were often at odds with one another, as each tribe sought to consolidate power in the aftermath of Rome's fall. But they were also influenced by Roman traditions and institutions, which they inherited and adapted to their own needs. The Visigoths, for example, adopted Roman law and Christian customs, and even sought to imitate the grandeur of the Roman Empire by building their own cities and infrastructure. However, it wasn't just the barbarians who were establishing new kingdoms. With the fall of the Roman Empire came the disintegration of central authority, and in its place, local leaders and warlords began to seize power. The fragments of Roman imperial structures that remained were not strong enough to hold the empire together. In the absence of Roman centralized rule, people turned to these new leaders for protection and governance, and thus, feudalism began to take shape, a hierarchical system where loyalty and land were exchanged for military service. One of the most significant changes brought about by the rise of these barbarian kingdoms was the spread of Christianity. The Roman Empire, in its later years, had embraced Christianity as its official religion, and this new faith would go on to play a central role in shaping the medieval world. As the barbarian tribes began to establish their own kingdoms, many converted to Christianity. The Franks, for example, under Clovis, adopted the Christian faith, which not only helped to legitimize his rule, but also paved the way for the Frankish kingdom to become one of the most powerful Christian empires in Europe. Despite their early differences, these barbarian kingdoms and their rulers found common ground in their shared Christianity and their desire to create a new order in the wake of Rome's fall. In many ways, these kingdoms formed the foundations of the medieval European world. The blend of Roman influence, local traditions, and Christian beliefs created a complex and unique cultural and political landscape that would shape Europe for centuries to come. As the barbarian kingdoms solidified their hold on power, it became clear that Europe was entering a new era, one that would be defined by feudalism, localism, and the spread of Christianity. Yet, as much as these new kingdoms laid the groundwork for the Middle Ages, they also faced significant challenges. Without the advanced infrastructure and centralized governance of Rome, they were vulnerable to further invasions, internal strife, and economic instability. But in this era of upheaval and transformation, a new societal order would gradually begin to emerge, one where kings, nobles, and the church would play central roles. The barbarian invasions and the establishment of these early medieval kingdoms didn't just mark the end of the Roman Empire. They signified the beginning of a new chapter in European history, one that would give rise to the feudal system and lay the groundwork for the future of medieval Europe. Christianity's influence and the spread of monasticism. The fall of the Western Roman Empire left a power vacuum in Europe, but as chaos reigned in the absence of central authority, one institution remained resilient and unifying: the Catholic Church. Christianity, which had already spread throughout the Roman Empire, now found itself in a unique position to fill the gaps left by the absence of Roman governance. The Church became the moral, spiritual, and eventually political backbone of the emerging medieval world. But how did this transformation occur? In the centuries following Rome's fall, the Church wasn't merely a religious institution, it became a major political force, influencing kings, emperors, and even the direction of entire kingdoms. This influence grew as the Church became one of the few stable institutions left in Europe after Rome's collapse. Where Roman law had once provided unity, Christian faith and ecclesiastical structures became the new glue binding people together in a fragmented and often violent world. One of the first significant actions of the Church in the wake of Rome's decline was the spread of monasticism. Monasteries, founded by men and women dedicated to a life of prayer, work, and charity, became safe havens of knowledge, culture, and preservation. The Benedictine rule, formulated by St. Benedict of Nursia in the 6th century, offered a framework for monastic life and would spread across Europe. The monks who followed the Benedictine rule were dedicated to hard work, meditation, and the copying of manuscripts, making monasteries crucial to the preservation of knowledge. These quiet, austere communities became the repositories of ancient learning, where scholars painstakingly copied not just Christian texts, but also works from classical antiquity, Greek and Roman manuscripts that would otherwise have been lost to history. As the monastic communities spread throughout Europe, they began to play a central role in daily life. Monasteries were often the largest and most important institutions in their communities, providing healthcare, education, and charity. They also became the centers of agricultural innovation, developing new techniques for farming that would later help feed the growing medieval population. The influence of these monasteries was profound, and many were built near important trade routes, helping to bring Christianity to new parts of Europe. The conversion of barbarian kings to Christianity was another pivotal moment in the spread of the faith. The Franks were among the first to adopt Christianity after the fall of Rome, with King Clovis I converting around 496 CE. His conversion to Christianity, and the subsequent conversion of his people, helped to solidify the Franks as a dominant Christian power in Western Europe. The Catholic Church, through strategic alliances with rulers like Clovis, began to gain not just spiritual authority, but political influence as well. By aligning itself with powerful rulers, the Church ensured that Christianity would not only survive the fall of Rome, but would thrive in the power vacuum that followed. But the Church's influence wasn't solely based on conversion and political alliances. It also created a cohesive cultural identity in Europe that transcended the political divisions caused by the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Christianity's promise of salvation offered a unifying vision for a continent torn apart by war and barbarism. The Church became the one institution that people across Europe could turn to for moral guidance and spiritual comfort, regardless of which kingdom or tribe they belonged to. As Christianity spread across Europe, it also adapted to local customs and traditions. The Church's ability to integrate itself into the fabric of daily life in the barbarian kingdoms was a testament to its flexibility and resilience. It was not just a foreign institution, but a deeply entrenched part of European society. From the cold northern reaches of Ireland to the sunlit coasts of the Mediterranean, Christianity was transforming Europe in ways both subtle and profound. Yet, this newfound prominence didn't come without challenges. While the Church provided stability and order, it also became a powerful force for control. Church leaders, including the Pope, exerted significant influence over rulers and kingdoms, sometimes leading to conflicts between the religious and secular authorities. This tension would continue to shape the history of medieval Europe, especially as the power of the Church continued to grow. In the centuries following Rome's fall, the Catholic Church not only played a central role in preserving the spiritual life of Europe, but also laid the groundwork for the Renaissance. Its efforts in promoting education, preserving knowledge, and cultivating a culture of learning would eventually lead to a rebirth of intellectual and artistic activity. Yet, despite all its successes, the Church also sowed the seeds for future divisions, such as the Great Schism and the later Protestant Reformation. The spread of Christianity and the growth of monasticism represent one of the most profound transformations in European history. In the wake of Rome's collapse, Christianity gave Europe both a new moral framework and a cultural continuity that would carry the continent through the early Middle Ages and into the modern world. It was this spiritual and cultural foundation that would allow Europe to begin rebuilding, laying the groundwork for the rise of medieval kingdoms and the eventual emergence of the Renaissance. Early medieval Europe's political landscape, as the dust settled after the fall of Rome, Europe found itself divided into countless kingdoms and regions, each struggling for power and control in a rapidly changing world. The absence of a centralized Roman authority left a fractured political landscape, where local rulers, tribal chiefs, and barbarian kings vied for dominance. These early medieval kingdoms were often built on the shifting sands of alliances, conquests, and shifting loyalties. Political stability was a distant dream. In this new world order, the traditional Roman structures of governance no longer applied. The great Roman Senate and imperial bureaucracy had dissolved, leaving behind a patchwork of territorial holdings. The barbarian tribes who had once been seen as invaders now became the new rulers of former Roman territories. With this political fragmentation came the rise of feudalism, a decentralized system of governance that would define much of medieval European life. Feudalism, in essence, was a system of land-based power. In the absence of strong central governments, political power was concentrated in the hands of local lords and landowners. In exchange for military service and loyalty, these lords granted land known as fiefs to vassals, who, in turn, swore allegiance to their lord. This system of reciprocal duties and loyalties formed the backbone of medieval politics. While kings and emperors ruled over vast territories, their power was often limited to the land they could control directly. In many cases, local lords and vassals exercised significant autonomy, leading to a fractured and often chaotic political environment. At the heart of this early medieval landscape was the Frankish kingdom, which played a crucial role in the consolidation of power during this period. Clovis I, the first king of the Franks, stands out as one of the most important early rulers. His conversion to Christianity, which united his kingdom under the banner of the Catholic faith, set the stage for the rise of the Merovingian dynasty. The Franks' powerful influence and their strategic alliances with the church helped them gain territory and solidify their rule over much of modern-day France and Germany. However, even the Franks faced challenges in governing their sprawling empire. After the death of Clovis, the kingdom was divided among his sons, and with it came instability. This division reflected the broader issue facing early medieval Europe. Without strong central authority, power often fragmented. The Carolingian dynasty, which would later rise to prominence under Charlemagne, emerged from these divisions, promising to bring unity to a fractured continent. Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, became one of the most significant figures in the early Middle Ages. By uniting much of Western Europe through conquest and diplomacy, he was crowned Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in 800 CE. Charlemagne's reign marked a brief moment of centralized control and stability, as he worked to strengthen the power of the monarchy and the influence of the church. He created a system of local administration known as the Missi Dominici, which helped him maintain control over his vast empire, ensuring that his decrees were enforced across his lands. Charlemagne's reign also saw a cultural renaissance of sorts. Under his patronage, the Carolingian Renaissance flourished, as schools were established and classical works were rediscovered and preserved. The church, which had grown in influence over the preceding centuries, played a key role in this intellectual revival, as many of the scholars at Charlemagne's court were clergymen. However, even Charlemagne's empire could not last. After his death, the empire was once again divided among his grandsons, and the Treaty of Verdun 843 CE split the empire into three parts. This division marked the beginning of the decline of the Carolingian Empire, and by the 9th and 10th centuries, Europe was once again fractured, with feudal lords and local rulers asserting their power in the absence of a central authority. In the north, the Vikings added another layer of complexity to the political landscape. These seafaring Norsemen, originating from Scandinavia, raided and eventually settled across much of Europe, from the British Isles to the Mediterranean. The Viking Age, which spanned from the late 8th century to the 11th century, brought with it waves of destruction, but also new cultural influences. The Vikings established the Danish kingdom in England and founded settlements in Normandy, which would later have significant political ramifications for Europe. Simultaneously, the Magyars, a nomadic group from the east, began to invade Central Europe, eventually settling in what is now Hungary. These invasions, combined with the growing influence of Muslim forces in the Mediterranean and the Slavic tribes in the east, created a highly unstable environment in medieval Europe. The political fragmentation of the continent continued throughout the early medieval period, with the rise of various kingdoms, principalities, and duchies, each vying for power and territory. Despite the chaos and division, these early medieval kingdoms began to lay the groundwork for future European states. As local lords gained power, they often sought to centralize authority in their own hands, leading to the eventual emergence of powerful monarchies. The feudal system, while fragmented, became the foundation upon which these kingdoms would be built. In this politically unstable environment, religion and local customs played a significant role in maintaining order. The Church, which had grown increasingly powerful, was not just a religious institution, but also a political one, with pope and bishops often holding more influence than kings. As the power of the Church continued to grow, its role in the political sphere became more pronounced, often providing the legitimacy needed for rulers to maintain control over their territories. By the time of the 11th century, Europe was on the cusp of a transformation that would lay the foundation for the High Middle Ages. The political landscape was still largely fractured, but the influence of the Church and the rise of feudal monarchies began to create a more stable system of governance that would shape the future of Europe for centuries to come. Transitioning into the High Middle Ages, as the first centuries of the medieval period unfolded, Europe's political landscape was in a state of flux. The decline of the Western Roman Empire had set the stage for an era of fragmentation and instability, marked by the rise and fall of barbarian kingdoms, the emergence of feudalism, and the spread of Christianity. By the 9th and 10th centuries, however, the groundwork was being laid for a new and more stable period, the High Middle Ages. This era would see the consolidation of power, the rise of monarchies, and a significant shift in Europe's social, political, and economic systems. One of the most important developments that paved the way for the High Middle Ages was the evolution of feudalism. Feudalism had initially emerged as a decentralized system of governance following the collapse of Rome, where power was fragmented and spread out among local lords and vassals. However, by the end of the 10th century, feudalism had begun to evolve into a more organized and hierarchical system. Powerful monarchs like those of the Capetian dynasty in France and the Ottonian dynasty in the Holy Roman Empire began to centralize power in their hands, consolidating territories and asserting their authority over the vassals who had once wielded more autonomy. At the same time, the Catholic Church continued to grow in influence. By this point, the Church had become not just a spiritual force, but also a political one, with the Pope wielding considerable power over secular rulers. The Papal States in Italy became a significant political entity, and the Church's influence extended far beyond just religious matters. Rulers sought the Church's approval for their legitimacy, and the Pope played a central role in coronations and political decisions across Europe. The period also saw the rise of a more urbanized society. While the early medieval period had been marked by rural settlements and a largely agrarian economy, by the 11th century, towns and cities began to grow once again. With the growth of commerce, trade, and a growing population, towns became centers of economic activity. The development of market towns and trade routes, particularly those that connected Europe to the Islamic world through the Mediterranean, facilitated the growth of a merchant class. This economic transformation would eventually give rise to a money economy, replacing the barter system that had dominated during the early Middle Ages. This urbanization also sparked the intellectual revival that would lay the foundations for the Renaissance. The growth of towns and the expansion of education led to the rise of universities, which began to flourish in cities like Paris, Bologna, and Oxford. The scholastic movement, which sought to reconcile faith and reason, gained traction during this period, with figures like Thomas Aquinas and Anselm of Canterbury helping to shape the intellectual climate of the High Middle Ages. Alongside the intellectual and economic developments, the political landscape of Europe was being shaped by a series of monarchical dynasties. Kings began to assert their dominance over larger territories, pushing back against the autonomy of local lords and vassals. The Capetian kings of France were among the first to centralize power, and their dynasty would go on to rule France for centuries. In England, the Norman conquest of 1066, led by William the Conqueror, marked a significant turning point. The conquest brought with it a new wave of feudalism, but with a more unified monarchy and a centralization of power. By the 12th century, the medieval monarchies were becoming more powerful and more organized, paving the way for the rise of centralized states. The English monarchy, under Henry II, began to create a system of common law, which would later influence legal systems throughout Europe. Similarly, the Holy Roman Empire, though often fragmented, saw a resurgence in power under rulers like Frederick Barbarossa, who sought to unify the German territories and assert imperial authority over Italy. Despite these advancements, the transition to the High Middle Ages was not without its challenges. Political instability was still common, as monarchs struggled to balance the power of the nobility with their own authority. The Viking invasions, which had begun in the late 8th century, were finally subsiding by the 11th century, but other threats, such as Hungarian invasions and Muslim conquests, continued to affect Europe's borders. The internal struggles for power, particularly between monarchs and the church, were ongoing and often led to conflicts that would define the medieval period for centuries. Perhaps one of the most defining characteristics of the transition into the High Middle Ages was the Crusades, a series of religiously motivated military campaigns that began in the late 11th century. The First Crusade, called by Pope Urban II in 1095, marked the beginning of centuries of religious conflict in the name of reclaiming the Holy Land from Muslim control. While the Crusades would have profound religious, cultural, and political consequences, they also fostered connections between different parts of the world, leading to an exchange of ideas, technology, and goods. The Crusades would ultimately shape the political and cultural landscape of Europe, as well as the relationship between the Christian West and the Muslim East. As Europe entered the 12th century, the foundations for a more stable, centralized, and urbanized society were being laid. The rise of strong monarchies, the increasing influence of the Catholic Church, the intellectual revival, and the expansion of trade and commerce all signaled the beginning of a new era in European history. The transition from the Dark Ages to the High Middle Ages set the stage for the great cultural and political changes that would follow, including the development of medieval chivalry, the establishment of universities, the creation of the first parliamentary systems, and the eventual flowering of the Renaissance. Feudalism takes root in Europe. Feudalism was the backbone of medieval European society, a system of land and loyalty that replaced the centralized authority of the Roman Empire. As local lords and vassals assumed more power in the aftermath of the fall of Rome, feudalism began to take root across Europe. At its core, feudalism was a decentralized political system in which land, or fiefs, was exchanged for military service and loyalty. Kings, unable to maintain direct control over their vast territories, delegated authority to local lords and barons. These landholders, in turn, had their own subordinates, vassals, who managed smaller territories and swore loyalty to them in exchange for land and protection. This mutual relationship of land for service created a highly structured society, but it was also vulnerable to instability, as each lord had their own private army and acted independently of central authority. The feudal system was rooted in both practical necessity and the weakness of centralized government. As invasions, like those of the Vikings, Magyars, and Saracens, ravaged Europe, the need for local defense became apparent. Charlemagne had attempted to create a more centralized system, but after his death, his empire fragmented into smaller, feudal territories. This fragmentation created local kingdoms, each with its own ruling lord. Thus, feudalism became the practical solution to ensure survival in a tumultuous, insecure world. Feudalism also deeply influenced medieval society's hierarchy. At the top were the kings, though their power was often symbolic. The real power was held by nobles who controlled land and had their own armies. Beneath the nobles were the peasants and serfs, bound to the land they worked, but their labor supported the entire feudal economy. This rigid social order ensured stability, but also limited social mobility. Feudalism shaped not only political structures, but also the economy. Lords managed agricultural production on their fiefs, and the work of peasants and serfs made the entire feudal system run. The medieval economy was primarily agrarian, and production was dictated by the seasonal rhythms of planting and harvesting. The rise of knights and the chivalric code in the midst of the feudal system emerged a unique class of warriors, the knights. Knights were a product of the feudal relationship between lords and vassals. They were the military elite, trained in the arts of combat and warfare, and they swore loyalty to a lord in exchange for land or the opportunity to fight for their benefactor. The knighthood was heavily influenced by the chivalric code, a set of moral guidelines that governed knights' behavior. The word chivalry comes from the Old French word chevalerie, meaning horsemanship, referring to knights' role as cavalry. But the code of chivalry was about much more than just warfare. It had a profound effect on medieval European culture, shaping how knights were expected to behave in battle, but also in society. The chivalric code stressed honor, bravery, and loyalty to one's lord, but it also had elements of religion, courtesy, and respect for women. Knights were seen as defenders of the faith, and often, their battles were justified as part of their Christian duty. As Christianity spread, so did the idea of knights as the protectors of the church, fighting in religious wars like the Crusades. The influence of the chivalric code can still be seen today in literature and popular culture, where knights are often portrayed as noble figures on quests to uphold justice. The knights were expected to be virtuous, showing mercy and kindness, particularly toward the poor and those in need. But there was also the reality of knighthood. Knights were often ruthless in battle and were bound to fight at a moment's notice. Despite this, the ideal of the knight as a heroic figure striving for justice and honor became ingrained in the collective consciousness of medieval Europe. The concept of courtly love also developed during this period. Though it was often idealized and not always practiced, the idea of knights serving ladies and upholding the virtues of loyalty and devotion became central to medieval romantic literature, especially in works like King Arthur and the Round Table. The influence of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was not merely a religious institution in medieval Europe, it was also one of the most powerful political entities. As the Roman Empire collapsed, the Church became the central authority that helped guide and unify Europe's fragmented kingdoms. By the 10th century, the Pope had become a key political figure, wielding power not just over religious matters, but over secular rulers as well. The Church's influence extended far beyond matters of faith. Popes and bishops often played the role of advisors to kings, helping to mediate disputes and offering legitimacy to rulers. In some cases, the Church even had the power to excommunicate kings and nobles, which had profound political consequences. The Church's influence reached its zenith during the reign of Pope Gregory VII in the 11th century, when he famously clashed with the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV over the issue of investiture, the right of monarchs to appoint bishops. This investiture controversy symbolized the immense power the Church wielded, as it was able to challenge even the authority of emperors and kings. The Catholic Church was also a key player in shaping European education. Monasteries, which had sprung up across the continent, were not just centers of prayer, they were also places of learning. Monks copied ancient texts, preserving much of the knowledge from the classical era. The medieval universities, which grew out of monastic and cathedral schools, were heavily influenced by the Church. These institutions would later become the intellectual powerhouses of the Middle Ages, leading to the scholasticism of the 12th century and the works of philosophers like Thomas Aquinas. However, the Church's power was not without controversy. Over time, its wealth and influence often came into conflict with secular rulers, leading to tensions between monarchs and the Church. The Crusades, which were initiated by the Church, were a prime example of how the Church sought to exert its influence, not just in religious matters, but in political and military affairs as well. The Church's involvement in the Crusades, the Inquisition, and the broader political landscape of Europe made it one of the most powerful forces in medieval life. Daily life in medieval castles and villages. The political and military structures of medieval Europe were grand in scale, but the daily lives of the people living under the feudal system were often focused on simpler, more practical concerns. Life in medieval castles and villages was shaped by the feudal order, with peasants and serfs working the land to support the nobility. In castles, the homes of feudal lords, life was both luxurious and dangerous. Castles were fortified structures designed to defend against invaders. They were often isolated, with the lord's family living in the central keep, while knights and other retainers lived in smaller buildings or on the grounds. The daily life of a lord or lady was marked by feasts, hunts, and courtly rituals, but also by the constant concern for security. The castle was the center of political life for the lord, who held court there and dispensed justice. For peasants and serfs, life was much harder. Most lived in small villages or on the lands of their lord. They worked the fields from sunrise to sunset, growing crops and raising livestock to support their families and to provide for the lord. Serfs were not free. They were bound to the land and had to give a portion of their crops to their lord as rent. Though they had few rights, they still formed the backbone of the medieval economy. Without their labor, the feudal system would not have functioned. Introduction to the Black Death. The Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague, arrived in Europe in the mid-14th century, but its origins can be traced back to Asia, where it had been causing havoc for centuries. It reached Europe through trade routes, particularly via the Silk Road, carried by rats and the fleas that infested them. In 1347, the first recorded case of the Black Death appeared in Italy, and within a few short years, the plague spread rapidly throughout Europe. Historians estimate that the Black Death killed anywhere from 25 to 50 million people, wiping out roughly 1/3 of Europe's population in a span of just 4 years. This made the Black Death one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. The disease itself was caused by a bacterium, Yersinia pestis, which spread through flea bites from infected rodents. However, at the time, the true cause of the plague was unknown, and people believed it was a divine punishment or a result of bad air miasma or imbalanced humors in the body. The plague caused a range of symptoms, starting with fever, chills, and headaches. Within hours or days, painful buboes, swollen lymph nodes would appear, often in the armpits, groin, or neck, turning black, hence the name Black Death. In many cases, death came within just a few days of the appearance of symptoms. The speed of the disease's spread and the high mortality rate contributed to its terrifying impact on the medieval population. The arrival of the plague in Europe. By 1347, the plague had reached Italy, where the first outbreaks occurred in Sicily and Genoa. From there, it spread rapidly through the rest of Italy, and then into France and Spain. France and England soon became the hardest hit regions, with London, Paris, and Avignon among the cities experiencing the highest death tolls. The plague's transmission was swift, and entire communities were wiped out in a matter of days. The spread of the plague was facilitated by the bustling trade networks of the time, which connected cities across Europe and the Mediterranean. As merchants and travelers moved between regions, they unknowingly carried the disease with them. The port cities, which were key hubs for trade, saw some of the highest mortality rates, and often, entire towns and villages were decimated in a matter of weeks. Once the plague arrived in a town, the impact was swift and devastating. The death tolls were staggering. Entire families perished, leaving villages deserted and cities eerily silent. Churches, monasteries, and homes became places of mass death. With so many people dying, there was no one left to bury the dead, leading to unburied corpses lying in the streets. Social order broke down, and fear and superstition spread quickly among the populace. In response to the plague, people resorted to a variety of coping mechanisms. Some turned to religion, believing that the plague was a punishment for sin. They engaged in processions, flagellations, and other forms of religious fervor, hoping to appease God and stop the plague. Others sought out witches and heretics, blaming them for the plague and engaging in violent acts of persecution. Social and economic disruption. The Black Death caused widespread social upheaval and economic collapse. The most immediate and obvious effect was the loss of life. Entire villages were wiped out, and workforces were decimated. In agricultural areas, fields were left untended, and crops rotted in the fields. The absence of labor led to a severe disruption in the production of food, resulting in widespread food shortages and rising prices. The labor shortage caused by the high mortality rates led to significant changes in the feudal system. With fewer people available to work the land, serfs who had been bound to their lord's estate suddenly found themselves in a position of power. As the demand for labor outstripped the supply, landowners were forced to offer better terms to workers. Wages increased, and serfs began to demand more rights and freedom. In some cases, this led to a rise in peasant uprisings, as workers took advantage of the power vacuum created by the plague's devastation. The social impact was not limited to the agricultural workforce. Urban centers saw their economies collapse, as skilled workers like craftsmen, merchants, and traders also died at alarming rates. Markets were disrupted, and guilds which had previously controlled trade and industry suffered significant losses. This disruption contributed to the decline of the medieval economy and the feudal system, which depended on a stable agricultural labor force. The Catholic Church, which had been a major institution of medieval Europe, also felt the effects of the plague. Priests, monks, and nuns were among the most affected by the disease, as they tended to the sick and buried the dead. This loss of religious leaders contributed to a crisis of faith, as many people began to question the Church's ability to protect them from disaster. The Church's wealth and influence also declined as land and resources were lost, and the number of believers in many areas dwindled. The long-term effects of the Black Death. While the Black Death had an immediate and devastating impact on Europe, its long-term effects were equally profound. The population loss during the plague years did not just lead to a shortage of labor and disruption of economic activity. It also set the stage for major social and cultural changes in the centuries that followed. One of the most significant long-term effects was the decline of feudalism. The labor shortage created by the Black Death gave peasants and serfs more bargaining power, and they began to demand better working conditions, higher wages, and greater freedom. In many regions, peasants were able to leave the land they worked on and seek employment elsewhere. As labor mobility increased, the traditional feudal structure, based on static land ownership and fixed social roles, began to break down. Additionally, the rise of a money economy began to replace the old feudal system of land-based wealth. With fewer people working the land, the feudal lords found it difficult to maintain their authority and control over vast estates. Towns and cities, once again, began to flourish, as trade and commerce slowly revived. The growing importance of cities and towns laid the foundation for the rise of capitalism and the merchant class, which would become increasingly influential in the centuries to come. Culturally, the Black Death left a lasting mark on the art, literature, and religion of Europe. The pessimistic view of life that emerged in the aftermath of the plague was reflected in the art of the period, with a focus on death and the fragility of human existence. Danse macabre, the dance of death, a popular theme in medieval art, portrayed people of all social classes dancing with skeletons, symbolizing the universality of death. The Church's influence was also significantly challenged by the plague. Clergy, who were supposed to offer spiritual guidance and protection, were often unable to prevent the suffering and death that the plague caused. This contributed to a crisis of faith, leading some to question the authority of the Church and contributing to the eventual Reformation in the 16th century. The Black Death's role in the emergence of the Renaissance. The Black Death was a catalyst for profound change in medieval Europe, and one of its most significant long-term consequences was its role in shaping the Renaissance. The Renaissance, a period of cultural rebirth, was influenced by many factors, but the Black Death played a critical role in disrupting medieval society. leading to the collapse of feudalism and the rise of a more dynamic and mobile economy. The increased wealth of merchants and the growth of cities in the aftermath of the plague laid the foundation for the intellectual and artistic flourishing of the Renaissance. The scarcity of labor following the plague also meant that the traditional hierarchies were loosened, allowing for a new class of thinkers, artists, and scholars to emerge. In addition, the weakening of the Church's authority and the rise of a more secular outlook paved the way for the humanist movement, which sought to reconnect with the intellectual traditions of ancient Greece and Rome. As Europe began to recover from the plague, these shifts in economic, social, and cultural structures would fuel the transformation that would come to define the Renaissance. The formation of monarchies the centuries following the fall of Rome saw Europe fragment into various kingdoms and principalities, each controlled by local lords. But over time, as Europe became more settled and the feudal system began to solidify, kings started to gain more authority. The formation of strong monarchies was a key turning point in medieval Europe, shifting power from the local lords to the central authority of kings and queens. One of the most significant early monarchs in this process was William the Conqueror, who, in 1066, conquered England in the Norman Conquest. By winning the Battle of Hastings, William defeated King Harold II, establishing Norman rule over England. His victory marked the beginning of a more centralized monarchy in England, as William introduced a system of feudalism, but with the crown holding ultimate power over the nobility. William's reign set a model for future kings to follow, creating a system in which the monarch had control over land, but still delegated land to the nobility in exchange for military service. However, the English monarchy became increasingly centralized over the centuries, particularly under the reign of later kings like Henry II, who sought to consolidate royal power through legal reforms and greater control over the barons. Similarly, France began to see the rise of powerful monarchs who sought to unify the fragmented kingdom. The Capetian dynasty, which began with Hugh Capet in 987, was a major force in centralizing power in France. Over time, the French monarchy expanded its territory, and the Capetian kings became more powerful, asserting their authority over both nobles and vassals. However, it was only in the 13th century under Louis IX Louis that the French monarchy began to enjoy a true period of centralization, with the king increasingly exerting control over local lords. As monarchs became more powerful, they began to challenge the authority of the church and the nobility, paving the way for the rise of nation-states in Europe. Kings started to view themselves as the ultimate authority in their realms, and the notion of absolute monarchy began to take shape, although it would not fully develop until later periods in history. The Hundred Years' War causes and early conflicts. The Hundred Years' War, fought between England and France from 1337 to 1453, is often seen as a defining conflict in medieval Europe. The war was rooted in territorial disputes, dynastic rivalries, and economic interests. At its core was the English throne's claim to French territories and the long-standing struggle for control of the French crown. The origins of the war lay in the complex relationship between the French monarchy and the English monarchy. After the death of Charles IV of France in 1328, the French throne passed to the Valois dynasty, while the Plantagenet kings of England, through their descent from a previous French king, Edward III, claimed the right to the French crown. Edward III's claim to the French throne set the stage for a series of territorial and dynastic conflicts that would ultimately lead to the outbreak of war in 1337. In the early years of the war, the English were initially successful, employing more effective military strategies and longbowmen who gave them a significant advantage on the battlefield. The Battle of Crusades in 1346, where the English decisively defeated the French, and the capture of Calais in 1347, demonstrated English dominance. These early victories allowed the English to solidify their control over large parts of northern France, including much of Gascony and the Flanders region. The war was marked by frequent truces and negotiations, but also by long periods of intense conflict. It was not just a battle for land, but also a contest for power between two monarchs, each seeking to assert their dominance over their rival. Key battles and turning points as the war continued. Both the French and the English experienced a series of military successes and setbacks. The conflict is often defined by the major battles that took place on French soil. One of the most significant early victories for the English came at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, where Edward the Black Prince, the son of Edward III, captured French King John II. The English once again demonstrated their tactical superiority, and the French monarchy was forced to negotiate a treaty, which included heavy concessions and the payment of a large ransom. However, the English failed to capitalize on this victory, and the war dragged on. The tide of the war began to turn in the French favor in the 15th century, thanks in large part to the influence of Joan of Arc, a peasant girl from Lorraine. In 1429, Joan claimed to have received divine visions instructing her to support the French Dauphin heir to the throne Charles VII and help him reclaim his kingdom. With her inspiration, the French lifted the siege of Orleans, a significant victory that revitalized French morale and gave them the momentum to push the English back. Joan's rise and eventual capture by the English was a pivotal moment in the war. Despite her martyrdom, her legacy lived on as a symbol of French nationalism and resistance against English oppression. The role of Joan of Arc, one of the most iconic figures of the 100 Years' War, was Joan of Arc, whose courage and determination would inspire generations. Joan's story begins in 1429, when she was a young peasant girl living in the village of Damer in northeastern France. Claiming to have heard voices from saints, she persuaded Charles VII, the Dauphin, to allow her to lead the French army against the English. Joan's leadership marked a turning point in the war. Under her guidance, the French forces achieved a stunning victory at the Siege of Orleans, a city that had been under English control. This victory boosted French morale and significantly weakened English influence in the region. Joan's success at Orleans was seen as a divine confirmation of her mission, and she became a symbol of hope for the French people. However, in 1430, Joan was captured by the English and handed over to the Burgundians, who were allies of the English. She was put on trial for charges including witchcraft, heresy, and cross-dressing, as she wore men's clothing during her campaigns. Joan was ultimately executed by burning at the stake in 1431, but her influence did not die with her. Joan was posthumously exonerated by the Church in the 1450s, and in 1920, she was canonized as a saint. Her legacy as a national hero of France remains strong to this day, and she is celebrated as a symbol of courage, faith, and resistance. The end of the war and the aftermath. The 100 Years' War officially ended in 1453 with the Treaty of Picquigny, though hostilities had already diminished by that point. By the time the war concluded, the English had lost almost all of their French territories, except for Calais, which remained in English hands until 1558. The war had significant consequences for both England and France. The English monarchy emerged from the war financially weakened, and the loss of territory in France contributed to the Wars of the Roses, a series of civil wars over the English throne. The English defeat also marked the decline of feudalism in England, as the war had shown the weaknesses of the feudal system, particularly in the context of long-term military campaigns. For France, the end of the war marked the beginning of a period of recovery and national consolidation. The war had been a brutal and costly conflict, but it had also sparked a sense of national identity among the French people, who now viewed themselves as a unified nation-state. The role of the French monarchy was solidified, and the Valois dynasty began its dominance in France for the next century. Introduction to the Renaissance. The term Renaissance comes from the French word for rebirth, and refers to the revival of classical learning and culture that began in Italy in the 14th century. The Renaissance marked the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of a new era in Europe, one characterized by a renewed interest in humanism, art, science, and exploration. Unlike the Middle Ages, when the Church was the central institution in Europe, and religion dominated intellectual life, the Renaissance emphasized the potential of the individual and the importance of human experience. It was a time when ancient Greek and Roman works were rediscovered, studied, and imitated, leading to new developments in philosophy, politics, literature, and the arts. The Italian city-states were at the heart of the Renaissance. Places like Florence, Venice, and Rome became centers of commerce, learning, and artistic production. Wealthy families such as the Medici in Florence were major patrons of the arts, funding artists, scholars, and architects who would go on to create some of the most iconic works in history. The rise of humanism and the revival of classical knowledge. At the heart of the Renaissance was humanism, a philosophical and intellectual movement that emphasized the study of classical texts, especially those of ancient Greece and Rome. Humanists believed that education should focus on subjects like rhetoric, philosophy, history, and literature, all of which were integral to the classical curriculum. This was a departure from the medieval scholastic focus on religious studies and the Bible. Petrarch, an Italian scholar and poet, is often credited with initiating the humanist movement. His discovery and preservation of ancient Roman texts helped to fuel the intellectual awakening of the Renaissance. Humanism emphasized the importance of the individual and the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, rather than solely for religious or practical purposes. Humanist scholars sought to recover lost works of antiquity, translating ancient manuscripts into the vernacular so that they could be read by a wider audience. This led to a surge in the production of books and written works, which in turn led to an intellectual revolution that impacted not only education but also art, literature, and politics. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the 15th century played a critical role in spreading Renaissance ideas across Europe, making books more widely available and accessible. The explosion of art and architecture. One of the most iconic aspects of the Renaissance was its artistic revolution. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, and Donatello created works of art that combined the classical ideals of harmony, proportion, and perspective, with a new emphasis on the human experience. Leonardo da Vinci, perhaps the most famous Renaissance artist, was not only a painter, but also an inventor, scientist, and engineer. His works, like the Mona Lisa and The Last Supper, are masterpieces of both technique and emotion. Leonardo's understanding of human anatomy and his use of light and shadow revolutionized portraiture and painting. Michelangelo was another towering figure of the Renaissance. His work on the Sistine Chapel ceiling in Rome, depicting scenes from the Book of Genesis, remains one of the most famous works of art in history. Michelangelo's sculptures, particularly his David, captured the beauty and complexity of the human form, demonstrating his mastery of anatomy and emotion. The Medici family, who ruled Florence, were major patrons of the arts, commissioning works from artists and architects who shaped the cultural landscape of Italy. The city became a hub of artistic and intellectual exchange, with the Medici's patronage fueling the careers of famous artists like Sandro Botticelli and Filippo Brunelleschi. The Renaissance also saw the development of perspective in painting, a technique that created the illusion of depth and space on a flat canvas. This innovation allowed artists to portray more realistic scenes, both in terms of the human body and the natural world. Raphael's works, such as the School of Athens, reflected this new sense of realism and depth, with the painting itself showcasing a gathering of philosophers from ancient Greece, depicted in perfect perspective. Architecture also underwent a revolution during the Renaissance. Architects like Brunelleschi, who designed the dome of the Florence Cathedral, and Donato Bramante, who contributed to the design of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, rediscovered and revived classical Roman architectural styles. The use of domes, columns, and arches became central to Renaissance architecture, reflecting the era's admiration for the grandeur of the ancient world. Scientific advancements and exploration. In addition to the artistic and intellectual achievements, the Renaissance also saw significant developments in science, mathematics, and exploration. Niccolo Machiavelli, a political theorist and diplomat, was one of the key figures in Renaissance political thought. His most famous work, The Prince, argued that rulers should be pragmatic and focus on maintaining power, rather than adhering strictly to traditional moral codes. Machiavelli's ideas laid the foundation for modern political science and were influential in shaping the development of the modern state. The scientific revolution was another critical aspect of the Renaissance. Thinkers like Copernicus, Galileo, and Kepler challenged the medieval worldview that placed the Earth at the center of the universe. Copernicus proposed the heliocentric model, which stated that the Sun, not the Earth, was the center of the universe. Galileo Galilei used the newly invented telescope to observe the heavens and provide evidence for Copernicus' theory, despite the opposition of the Catholic Church. The Renaissance also marked the beginning of the Age of Exploration. Christopher Columbus's voyages to the Americas in 1492, funded by the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, opened up new routes for trade, exploration, and cultural exchange. Vasco da Gama's journey around the Cape of Good Hope to India in 1498 established direct trade routes between Europe and Asia, reshaping global commerce. The end of the Renaissance and the beginning of the modern age. While the Renaissance did not mark the end of the Middle Ages, it was undoubtedly a major break from the medieval worldview. The Renaissance laid the foundation for many of the political, artistic, and scientific developments that would define the modern age. By the end of the 16th century, the Renaissance was transitioning into the Baroque period, characterized by more ornate and dramatic art and architecture. However, the cultural achievements of the Renaissance continued to resonate throughout Europe and beyond. The ideals of humanism, the revival of classical knowledge, and the artistic innovations of the period would influence thinkers, writers, and artists for centuries to come. The rise of nation-states, the spread of Protestantism and the Reformation, and the beginning of the scientific revolution also represented shifts toward modernity, as the Renaissance had sown the seeds for intellectual, religious, and political transformations that would unfold in the centuries that followed. The spirit of exploration and the quest for new trade routes. The Age of Discovery was driven by a combination of technological advances, economic needs, and the quest for power. For centuries, Europe had been aware of other lands beyond its borders, but it was not until the late 15th century that the means to explore those distant regions began to come together. One of the primary motivations for exploration was the search for new trade routes. During the Middle Ages, the Silk Road facilitated trade between Europe and Asia, but it was increasingly threatened by Muslim empires that controlled much of the Middle East and North Africa. European merchants, particularly the Italians and Portuguese, sought new sea routes to the east, bypassing the land routes controlled by the Ottomans and other powers. The key to the Age of Discovery was the advancements in navigation and shipbuilding. The development of the caravel, a new type of light and fast-sailing ship, made it possible for explorers to sail farther than ever before. Astrolabes and sextants allowed navigators to calculate their position at sea, while more accurate maps and better understanding of wind patterns like the trade winds made long-distance ocean voyages feasible. At the same time, European monarchs saw exploration as a way to increase their wealth and expand their influence. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain funded Christopher Columbus' famous journey in 1492, while King John II of Portugal supported Vasco da Gama's voyages to India. The competition between European monarchies to claim new territories and establish trade routes pushed the exploration of the world's oceans to new heights. Columbus and the discovery of the New World in 1492, the most famous voyage of the Age of Discovery, occurred when Christopher Columbus, an Italian explorer sailing under the Spanish flag, embarked on a journey westward across the Atlantic Ocean in search of a new route to Asia. Columbus, who believed the Earth was smaller than it was, thought he could reach the east by sailing west from Europe. Columbus set sail from the port of Palos de la Frontera in Spain, crossing the Atlantic with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. After a long and perilous voyage, Columbus and his crew landed on what they believed was an island off the coast of Asia, but which was actually the Caribbean, in the Bahamas. Columbus made several voyages to the New World over the next decade, exploring parts of the Caribbean, Hispaniola, and Central America, and inadvertently discovered lands previously unknown to Europe. Columbus' discoveries were monumental, as they opened up the New World for European colonization. His voyages also initiated the Columbian Exchange, a vast exchange of plants, animals, foods, diseases, and ideas between the Eastern and Western hemispheres. While Columbus is often credited with discovering the Americas, it is important to note that indigenous peoples had been living on the continent for thousands of years, and Viking explorers like Leif Erikson had visited parts of North America centuries earlier. The consequences of Columbus' voyages were far-reaching. The Spanish began to colonize the Caribbean and South America, extracting gold, silver, and other resources. Soon after, other European nations followed suit, and the Americas were drawn into the global trade network, forever altering the world's economic and cultural landscape. Vasco da Gama and the Portuguese route to India. While Columbus' voyages opened up the New World, another significant route was being charted by the Portuguese. Vasco da Gama, a Portuguese explorer, is best known for being the first European to reach India by sea. Da Gama's successful voyage to the Indian subcontinent marked a new chapter in the quest for maritime routes to Asia and established Portugal as a major power in the age of exploration. In 1497, da Gama sailed from Lisbon, Portugal, and rounded the southern tip of Africa, at the Cape of Good Hope, reaching India in 1498. This opened up a direct sea route for trade between Europe and Asia, bypassing the overland routes controlled by Muslim empires in the Middle East. Da Gama's journey allowed Portugal to establish a network of trade posts and colonies along the coast of East Africa, India, and Southeast Asia, marking the beginning of the Portuguese Empire in the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese were able to establish their dominance in the spice trade, and their route to India became a critical part of the global trade network. Portugal's maritime empire, built on the trade of spices, silks, and precious metals, made it one of the wealthiest and most powerful European nations during the 16th century. Da Gama's voyages also encouraged other European powers, especially Spain, France, and England, to explore new trade routes to the East and South Asia. Magellan and the first circumnavigation of the globe, the Age of Discovery, reached new heights, with the expedition of Ferdinand Magellan, the first explorer to lead an expedition that would circumnavigate the globe, proving that the Earth was round and that the world was much larger than previously thought. Although Magellan did not survive the entire journey, his expedition demonstrated the potential for global trade and exploration. Magellan, a Portuguese navigator, set sail in 1519 with a fleet of 5 ships under the Spanish flag, seeking to find a westward route to the Spice Islands in the East Indies. After navigating through the Strait of Magellan at the southern tip of South America, Magellan's fleet sailed into the Pacific Ocean, an ocean that Europeans had little knowledge of. Tragically, Magellan was killed in the Philippines in 1521 before he could complete the voyage, but his expedition, under the command of Juan Sebastián and Elcano, continued on and returned to Spain in 1522, nearly 3 years after setting out. The circumnavigation of the Earth provided proof of the true size of the planet and further expanded European knowledge of the world. It also confirmed that global travel was possible and opened up new trade possibilities between Europe, Asia, and the Americas. The impact of the Age of Discovery on Europe and the world. The Age of Discovery radically transformed Europe and the rest of the world, with profound economic, social, and political consequences. The opening of new trade routes to Africa, the Americas, and Asia allowed European nations to build vast empires and increase their wealth through trade in gold, silver, spices, precious stones, and slaves. The wealth generated by these colonies laid the foundation for the rise of capitalism in Europe and the development of powerful nation-states. The Columbian Exchange facilitated the exchange of crops, animals, and diseases between the Old World and the New World. Crops such as corn, potatoes, and tomatoes transformed European diets, while horses, cattle, and wheat were introduced to the Americas. However, the exchange was not without tragedy. European diseases such as smallpox devastated indigenous populations in the Americas, leading to the decimation of entire societies. The slave trade became one of the darkest aspects of the Age of Discovery. As Europeans established colonies in the Americas, they relied heavily on enslaved Africans to work on plantations, particularly in the Caribbean and Brazil. This brutal practice lasted for centuries, shaping the history of the Atlantic world and contributing to the development of the triangular trade that brought goods, slaves, and raw materials between Africa, the Americas, and Europe. The Renaissance, a cultural awakening. The Renaissance marked a period of renewed interest in the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome, as well as a break from the religiously dominated medieval worldview. It was a time when humanism, philosophy that emphasized the value of human potential and achievements, flourished. The period saw great advances in art, literature, philosophy, and science, and it laid the intellectual and cultural foundations for the modern world. In Italy, the birthplace of the Renaissance, city-states like Florence, Venice, and Rome became vibrant centers of culture and learning. Wealthy patrons, such as the Medici family, funded artists and scholars, enabling the development of iconic works of art and groundbreaking intellectual ideas. Figures like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael revolutionized art, creating masterpieces that blended realism with an emphasis on human emotion and classical ideals. At the same time, humanist scholars like Petrarch and Erasmus helped to recover ancient texts, and Niccolo Machiavelli wrote his influential political treatise, The Prince, which examined the nature of power and leadership. These thinkers believed that the study of history, rhetoric, and philosophy could provide a guide for living a meaningful and successful life. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440 also had a profound impact on the Renaissance. It allowed for the mass production of books and the widespread dissemination of knowledge, making books more accessible and affordable. The printing press played a crucial role in spreading Renaissance ideas across Europe, contributing to the growth of literacy and education. The beginnings of the Protestant Reformation. The Reformation began as a religious movement in the early 16th century, seeking to reform the Catholic Church. At its heart was a deep dissatisfaction with church practices, particularly the sale of indulgences, payments for the forgiveness of sins, and the Church's vast wealth and power. One of the key figures in the Reformation was Martin Luther, a German monk, who in 1517 nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church, protesting against the sale of indulgences. Luther's theological ideas were revolutionary. He argued that salvation could not be bought or earned through good works or indulgences, but was instead a gift from God, granted through faith alone. Luther's views were influenced by humanist ideas that emphasized a return to the original texts of the Bible and a personal relationship with God, rather than reliance on the church hierarchy. Luther's challenge to the church quickly gained support, especially in Germany, where political leaders saw an opportunity to assert their independence from Rome. Luther's ideas were spread widely through the use of the printing press, and they sparked religious debates and political conflicts across Europe. The Diet of Worms in 1521 was a key moment, where Luther famously refused to recant his beliefs, declaring, "Here I stand, I can do no other." As a result, Luther was excommunicated by the Pope, but his followers, known as Lutherans, formed a new branch of Christianity that rejected the authority of the Pope and the Catholic Church. Luther's translation of the Bible into German allowed ordinary people to read the scriptures for themselves, breaking the Church's monopoly on religious knowledge. The spread of Protestantism and the rise of new denominations. Luther's break with the Catholic Church inspired other reformers across Europe. In Switzerland, John Calvin developed the doctrine of predestination and established a theocratic government in Geneva. Calvin's ideas spread quickly, especially in France, where his followers, known as Huguenots, became a significant religious minority. Calvinism also spread to the Netherlands, Scotland, and parts of Germany, challenging the authority of the Catholic Church and contributing to religious division across Europe. In England, the Reformation took a unique form under King Henry VIII, who, in the 1530s, broke away from the Catholic Church after the Pope refused to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. In response, Henry established the Church of England Anglican Church, making himself the supreme head of the church. This break from Rome was driven more by political and personal reasons than theological ones, but it nevertheless led to the establishment of a Protestant denomination in England. The Counter-Reformation was the Catholic Church's response to the Protestant movement. It sought to address the issues raised by reformers and to reaffirm Catholic teachings. In 1545, the Council of Trent was convened, and it resulted in a series of reforms including the reaffirmation of the Church's authority, the establishment of seminaries for the proper education of priests, and the outlawing of the sale of indulgences. The Church also strengthened its missionary activities, sending Jesuits like Ignatius of Loyola to spread Catholicism in the Americas, Asia, and Africa. The political and social impact of the Reformation. The Reformation had far-reaching political and social consequences. It not only challenged the religious authority of the Catholic Church, but also reshaped the balance of power in Europe. Monarchs who had supported Protestant reforms often used religious differences to assert their independence from the Pope and the Catholic Church. Protestant and Catholic factions in Europe engaged in wars and conflicts, most notably the 30 Years' War 1618-1648, which devastated much of Central Europe. The Reformation also led to the rise of the nation-state. As monarchs gained more control over religious matters, they began to consolidate their power within their territories, leading to the formation of strong centralized governments. This shift laid the groundwork for the political landscape of early modern Europe, where rulers increasingly sought to govern their kingdoms without interference from the Pope or other religious authorities. Socially, the Reformation encouraged a greater focus on individualism and the reading of the Bible. The Protestant emphasis on reading and interpreting the scriptures in the vernacular led to increased literacy rates, especially in Northern Europe, where Protestantism took hold. Protestantism also promoted the idea of the priesthood of all believers, meaning that all Christians had the right to interpret the Bible for themselves, further empowering individuals in religious and social matters. The legacy of the Reformation and Renaissance. The legacy of the Renaissance and the Reformation is profound. The Renaissance helped to foster the intellectual climate that allowed the Reformation to take hold, as humanist ideas about individual autonomy and the importance of personal conscience found fertile ground in the Reform movement. The Reformation, in turn, radically reshaped the religious and political landscape of Europe, leading to centuries of religious conflict, but also the establishment of the modern concept of religious freedom and secular governance. The Renaissance contributed to the rise of scientific inquiry, the development of modern art, and the spread of humanist ideals that influenced politics, philosophy, and literature for centuries. Figures like Martin Luther and John Calvin not only transformed religious thought, but also sparked revolutions in social and political structures, influencing the shape of the modern world. The Reformation also played a key role in the dissolution of feudalism, as the rise of Protestantism often meant the weakening of the Church's authority over local lords and monarchs. This, combined with the growing influence of humanism and scientific thought, set the stage for the intellectual and political upheavals that would follow in the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. The rise of absolutism in Europe. The age of absolutism was characterized by monarchs who sought to consolidate power in their own hands, reducing the influence of nobility and parliaments. The central idea behind absolutism was the belief that the monarch's authority was divinely ordained, and that the king or queen was accountable only to God, not to any earthly institution. This system of absolute monarchy took hold in several European countries, particularly in France, Russia, and Prussia. One of the most famous proponents of absolute monarchy was Louis XIV of France, known as the Sun King. Louis XIV reigned for over 70 years, 1643–1715, making him the longest reigning monarch in European history. Louis sought to centralize power by diminishing the role of the nobility and ruling through a bureaucratic system loyal to the crown. He famously declared, "L'état, c'est moi, the state, it is I." emphasizing his belief that he was the embodiment of the French state. Louis XIV's reign was marked by the construction of the lavish Palace of Versailles, a symbol of his absolute power. By moving the court to Versailles, Louis was able to control the French nobility, forcing them to live at the palace and participate in court rituals, thus preventing them from engaging in politics and creating their own power bases. Under his rule, France became a dominant European power, although it also faced significant financial strain due to wars and extravagant spending. In Russia, Peter the Great similarly sought to centralize power and modernize his country. Peter introduced Western reforms in both military and civilian life, including modernizing the army and navy, introducing European-style clothing, and establishing new government institutions. Peter's efforts were aimed at transforming Russia into a powerful European state, and he famously built the new capital city of St. Petersburg on land he wrested from Sweden. In Prussia, Frederick the Great was another monarch who exercised absolute control, although his rule was more enlightened than that of some other absolutists. Frederick was a patron of the arts and philosophy, and promoted legal reforms that improved the lives of his subjects. He is remembered for his military prowess and for expanding Prussian territory during the 7 Years' War. While absolute monarchy brought stability and centralized power to many European countries, it also led to the concentration of power in the hands of a single ruler, often at the expense of civil liberties and political representation. The philosophy of absolutism and divine right. The idea of absolutism was closely tied to the concept of the divine right of kings, the belief that monarchs derived their authority directly from God, and thus their decisions could not be questioned by any earthly power, including the church or the people. This theory was most famously articulated by the political philosopher Jacques-Benin Bossuet, who argued that the king's power was sacred and that he acted as God's representative on earth. Bossuet's ideas were widely accepted by monarchs throughout Europe, particularly in countries like France and Spain, where the church was often complicit in reinforcing the monarch's power. The divine right theory was a powerful tool for monarchs who sought to justify their absolute rule, but it also led to tensions between rulers and the growing middle class, who increasingly demanded political participation and representation. In many European states, the nobility still retained significant influence, even during the age of absolutism. In France, for example, the nobility played a critical role in the governance of local regions. However, Louis XIV managed to suppress their political power by making them dependent on his favor at the court. Meanwhile, in England, the idea of divine right was challenged by the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which led to the establishment of a constitutional monarchy, where the king's power was limited by law. The Enlightenment, a new age of reason. While absolute monarchy sought to centralize power in the hands of a single ruler, the Enlightenment of the 18th century represented a dramatic shift in European thinking. The Enlightenment was an intellectual movement that emphasized the use of reason, science, and individual rights as the basis for understanding and improving society. Thinkers, known as philosophes, rejected the traditional hierarchies and dogma of the church and monarchy, advocating instead for a society based on rational thought and natural laws. One of the central ideas of the Enlightenment was the notion that all individuals are born with certain natural rights, including the rights to life, liberty, and property. John Locke, an English philosopher, was one of the most influential proponents of these ideas. Locke argued that people had the right to overthrow any government that violated their rights, and his ideas would later inspire revolutions in both America and France. In France, Voltaire was another key figure of the Enlightenment. Known for his sharp wit and criticism of the Catholic Church, Voltaire championed freedom of speech and religious tolerance. He believed that progress could be achieved through education, and he worked to promote a separation between church and state. Voltaire's writings challenged the status quo, and he became one of the most widely read authors in Europe. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, another prominent philosopher, developed ideas about democracy and the social contract. In his book, The Social Contract, Rousseau argued that legitimate political authority comes from the people, and that individuals must consent to be governed by the general will. Rousseau's theories greatly influenced revolutionary movements, particularly in France and America. The political impact of the Enlightenment. The ideas of the Enlightenment had a profound effect on politics, particularly in the American Revolution and the French Revolution. Enlightenment thinkers argued that monarchs should not have absolute power, and that governments should be based on the will of the people. This theory laid the intellectual groundwork for the American Declaration of Independence 1776 and the French Revolution 1789, both of which sought to overthrow systems of absolute monarchy and establish republics based on democratic principles. In America, the writings of John Locke and Montesquieu inspired the framers of the U.S. Constitution, which established a government based on separation of powers and the protection of individual rights. The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, codified these principles, ensuring the protection of personal freedoms and limiting the power of the government. Meanwhile, in France, the ideas of the Enlightenment influenced the French Revolution, which sought to replace the absolute monarchy of Louis XVI with a republic. The revolutionaries, inspired by Enlightenment ideals, sought to establish a government based on liberty, equality, and fraternity. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, adopted during the Revolution, was a direct reflection of Enlightenment thought, asserting the rights of individuals and challenging the traditional powers of the monarchy and the church. The decline of absolutism and the rise of modern democracies. The intellectual and political changes brought about by the Enlightenment led to the decline of absolutism in many parts of Europe. While monarchs like Louis XIV had sought to centralize power, the writings of Locke, Voltaire, and others laid the foundation for democratic thought and constitutional government. The rise of constitutional monarchies in countries like England and the establishment of republics in the Americas and France marked the shift from absolute rule to systems that valued individual rights and popular sovereignty. The Enlightenment also played a key role in the development of modern science and education, encouraging the pursuit of knowledge and critical thinking. The application of reason to all areas of life led to advancements in fields ranging from philosophy to economics and medicine to politics. The legacy of the Enlightenment continues to influence modern democratic ideals, human rights, and the separation of powers in contemporary governments. Causes of the French Revolution. The causes of the French Revolution were both economic and social, deeply rooted in the political, economic, and intellectual conditions of late 18th century France. For many years, France had been burdened with severe economic problems, largely caused by costly wars such as the 7 Years' War and France's involvement in the American Revolution and extravagant spending by the monarchy. Economic crisis. By the late 1780s, King Louis XVI and his finance ministers found themselves unable to manage France's growing debt. The French economy was in severe distress due to high taxation, inefficient government spending, and poor harvests that led to widespread hunger. The tax burden fell primarily on the lower classes, while the nobility and the clergy were exempt from many taxes. This inequality contributed to widespread discontent among the common people, or third estate, which included peasants, artisans, and the growing bourgeoisie middle class. Social inequality. France's social structure was still deeply entrenched in the ancien régime, a system that divided the population into 3 estates. The first estate, the clergy Catholic Church, which had significant political and economic power. The second estate, the nobility, which owned much of the land and had special privileges, including tax exemptions. The third estate, the common people, who made up about 98% of the population. This group was burdened with taxes and had little political power. The economic crisis combined with deep social inequality created widespread dissatisfaction and a growing desire for reform. The bourgeoisie, wealthy merchants, lawyers, and intellectuals began to demand a larger role in government, seeking more political representation and the elimination of privileges for the nobility and clergy. Social inequality, intellectual influence, in addition, economic hardship and social injustice. The ideas of the Enlightenment played a significant role in sparking the French Revolution. Philosophers like John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Voltaire questioned the legitimacy of absolute monarchy and called for individual rights, popular sovereignty, and the establishment of democratic governments. The Enlightenment's focus on reason, equality, and human rights inspired many in France, particularly the bourgeoisie, who saw the existing political system as outdated and unfair. The Estates General and the formation of the National Assembly. In the face of the economic crisis, King Louis XVI convened the Estates General in May 1789, an assembly of representatives from the three estates. This was the first time the Estates General had met since 1614, and it was intended to address the growing financial crisis. However, the Third Estate quickly realized that the meeting would be dominated by the First and Second Estates, which had more political power. As a result, the representatives of the Third Estate declared themselves the National Assembly, claiming to represent the people of France. This was a bold challenge to the authority of the king and the traditional structure of French society. On June 20, 1789, after being locked out of their meeting place, the members of the National Assembly swore the tennis court oath, vowing not to disband until they had created a new constitution for France. This act marked the beginning of the French Revolution and signaled the collapse of the absolute monarchy. The fall of the Bastille and the revolution begins on July 14, 1789. A mob of Parisians stormed the Bastille, a royal prison and symbol of royal tyranny. The fall of the Bastille marked the beginning of the revolution in earnest, as it was seen as a victory for the people over the monarchy. The storming of the Bastille also symbolized the triumph of the common people over the aristocracy and the king's authority. Following this, the great fear spread across the countryside, as rumors of aristocratic plots to suppress the revolution led peasants to rise up against their landlords. The National Assembly responded by abolishing feudal privileges in August 1789, including the feudal dues and tithes that had burdened the peasants for centuries. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, passed by the National Assembly in August 1789, outlined the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. It proclaimed that all men were born free and equal in rights, and it laid the foundation for the new French Republic. The radical phase and the reign of terror. As the revolution progressed, it became more radical. The National Assembly was replaced by the National Convention in 1792, and France was declared a republic. King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette were arrested, tried, and executed by guillotine in 1793, signaling the end of the monarchy. The revolution entered its most radical phase under the leadership of Maximilien Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety. The period known as the Reign of Terror 1793–1794 saw thousands of counter-revolutionaries, royalists, and perceived enemies of the revolution executed. The revolutionaries believed that the only way to preserve the revolution was through violence, and the guillotine became a symbol of the new revolutionary justice. During the Reign of Terror, the church was also attacked. Church properties were seized, and the Catholic religion was suppressed. The de-Christianization of France became a key goal of the radical revolutionaries, and Robespierre's cult of the Supreme Being replaced Christianity with a state-sanctioned civic religion. However, the radical phase ended in 1794, with the fall of Robespierre. He was arrested and executed, marking the end of the Reign of Terror and the beginning of a more moderate phase of the revolution. The rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. In the aftermath of the revolution, France was still in turmoil. The Directory, a five-member executive body, struggled to maintain control over the country and faced challenges from both royalists and revolutionaries. It was during this period of instability that Napoleon Bonaparte, a military general who had risen to prominence during the revolution, seized power in a coup d'état in 1799. Napoleon's rise marks the end of the revolution and the beginning of the Napoleonic era. In 1804, he crowned himself Emperor of the French, consolidating power and establishing a new monarchy. However, despite his imperial title, Napoleon implemented many of the revolutionary reforms, such as the Napoleonic Code, which codified laws related to individual rights, property, and the role of the state. Napoleon's military conquest spread revolutionary ideals across Europe, but they also led to widespread war and destruction. His campaigns, known as the Napoleonic Wars, reshaped the map of Europe and set the stage for the Congress of Vienna in 1815, which sought to restore order after Napoleon's defeat. The legacy of the French Revolution. The French Revolution had a profound and lasting impact on France and the world. It inspired revolutions in other parts of Europe and the Americas, leading to the spread of democratic ideals and the end of monarchy in many places. The revolution also gave rise to modern nationalism and citizen rights, which became central to political movements in the 19th and 20th centuries. In France, the revolution abolished the old social order and established a republic, although it was not until the Third Republic 1870 that France would fully embrace republican ideals. Napoleon's legacy, while controversial, helped to codify many of the changes brought about by the revolution, including legal equality, secular education, and civil rights. The revolution also left a deep mark on political thought. The ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity became central to democratic movements, and the notion of popular sovereignty, that the people have the right to govern themselves, was solidified as a fundamental principle of modern democracy. The beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution began in Britain in the late 18th century, driven by a combination of factors, including a surplus of capital, a growing population, and the availability of raw materials like coal and iron. Britain's geographic location, access to colonies, and the rise of a market economy also played significant roles in making the country the birthplace of industrialization. Technological innovations. The spinning jenny, invented by James Hargreaves in 1764, was one of the first major technological breakthroughs that revolutionized the textile industry. It allowed workers to spin multiple spools of thread at once, greatly increasing productivity. The water frame, invented by Richard Arkwright, further mechanized the spinning process, leading to the creation of factories. Another critical innovation was the steam engine, perfected by James Watt in the 1770s. Watt's steam engine became a driving force for industries beyond textiles, including mining, transportation, and manufacturing. The steam engine allowed for the mechanization of production processes and was the key to powering the new factories that began to sprout up across Britain. The development of the railroad was also a critical part of the Industrial Revolution. George Stephenson's locomotion number 11814 and later the rocket 18-9 revolutionized transportation by allowing goods and people to move quickly over long distances. The expansion of the railroad network stimulated the economy, facilitated trade, and opened new markets for industrial goods. The growth of industry and urbanization. The rise of industry had a profound impact on urbanization. As factories sprang up in cities, workers flocked to urban areas in search of jobs. This rapid shift from an agrarian economy to an industrial one led to a massive growth in the size of cities, with major industrial centers such as Manchester, Liverpool, and London expanding rapidly. Factory life and labor conditions. The factory system was built on mass production and division of labor, where workers performed specialized tasks. Child labor was common, with children as young as 5 or 6 working long hours in hazardous conditions. Factory workers often worked 12 to 16-hour shifts with minimal breaks, earning low wages for their labor. Women were also heavily employed in factories, particularly in textiles, but they earned lower wages than men for the same work. The working conditions in factories were often poor, with long hours, dangerous machinery, and little regard for worker safety. The rapid pace of industrialization, along with the lack of regulation, led to widespread exploitation of workers. In cities, Overcrowding and poor living conditions led to the spread of disease, and workers often lived in cramped, unsanitary housing. The impact on society and class structure. The Industrial Revolution led to the rise of the middle class, particularly the bourgeoisie, who became the new industrialists, factory owners, and entrepreneurs. The wealth generated by industry allowed this class to flourish, gaining political and economic power that had previously been held by the landed aristocracy. This newly wealthy class embraced capitalism, which emphasized free markets, competition, and private ownership of production. The working class, on the other hand, the working class, often referred to as the proletariat, lived in harsh conditions. The working class was made up of factory workers, miners, and laborers who had little control over their working conditions and lived in poverty. Many of them worked in unsafe conditions, with few legal protections or rights. The growth of the industrial economy also created a great disparity in wealth between the industrial capitalists and the working poor. As a result, the Industrial Revolution exacerbated class divisions, and tensions between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat grew. The rise of socialism and labor movements. The harsh conditions faced by workers during the Industrial Revolution led to growing discontent and calls for reform. Social thinkers and philosophers, such as Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, criticized the excesses of industrial capitalism and argued that the working class was being exploited. In their Communist Manifesto 1848, Marx and Engels called for a revolution in which the working class would overthrow the capitalist system and create a classless society. At the same time, workers began to organize and demand better conditions. The rise of labor unions and the push for workers' rights led to the development of the labor movement in Europe and the United States. Workers began to fight for better wages, shorter hours, and improved safety conditions in the workplace. Strikes and protests became common as workers sought to gain a voice in the industrial economy. In Britain, the Chartist movement of the 1830s and 1842 advocated for political reforms, including universal suffrage for men, as well as reforms to improve working conditions. Over time, many of the demands of the labor movement, including the right to vote and the establishment of labor laws, would be achieved. The global impact of the Industrial Revolution. While the Industrial Revolution began in Great Britain, it quickly spread to other parts of Europe, including France, Germany, and Belgium, and eventually to the United States and Japan. The revolution had a global impact, reshaping trade, economics, and geopolitics. Imperialism and colonial expansion. The Industrial Revolution fueled imperialism, as industrialized nations sought new markets for their goods and sources of raw materials. European powers established colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Americas to exploit resources and expand their markets. This period of imperial expansion led to the scramble for Africa and the domination of large parts of the world by European powers. The growing demand for raw materials like cotton, rubber, and oil drove European nations to colonize vast regions, often at the expense of indigenous populations. The Industrial Revolution thus played a significant role in the development of the modern global economy, as industrialized nations became dominant players in world trade. Technological innovations beyond industry. The innovations of the Industrial Revolution were not limited to industry and labor. New technologies such as the telegraph, the steamship, and the railroad revolutionized communication and transportation, facilitating global trade and the movement of people and ideas. The legacy of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution fundamentally transformed every aspect of life in Europe and the world. It led to the creation of modern capitalism, the growth of the middle class, and the rise of urbanization. The revolution also sparked social movements, as workers demanded better conditions and equality, leading to significant political and social reforms in the 19th and 20th centuries. At the same time, the environmental impact of industrialization was profound. The widespread use of coal and the expansion of factories contributed to the pollution of air, water, and land. The effects of industrialization on the environment would continue to be felt for centuries, leading to the modern environmental movement in the 20th century. Economically, the Industrial Revolution led to an era of unprecedented growth and wealth, but also increased inequality and exploitation. The benefits of industrialization were not evenly distributed, and the revolution's impact on the working class remains a subject of debate and discussion. The legacy of the Industrial Revolution is also seen in the rise of modern technology, which has continued to evolve and shape our world. The innovations of the 18th and 19th centuries laid the foundation for the technological advancements that characterize the modern age. The legacy of the Industrial Revolution. The American Revolution, the birth of a new nation. The American Revolution, 1775-1783, was a key event in the Age of Revolutions, marking the first successful rebellion against a colonial power and the birth of a republic based on the principles of democracy, individual rights, and self-governance. The revolution was inspired by Enlightenment ideas, particularly those of John Locke, who argued for the rights to life, liberty, and property, as well as popular sovereignty. Causes of the revolution. Tensions between the American colonies and Great Britain had been growing for years. The British government imposed a series of taxes, such as the Stamp Act 1765 and the Townshend Acts 1767, without granting the colonies representation in Parliament. The famous slogan, "No taxation without representation," captured the frustration of the colonists, who resented being taxed without having a voice in the decisions that affected them. The Boston Massacre 1770, where British soldiers killed 5 colonists during a protest. And the Boston Tea Party 1773, where American colonists dumped British tea into Boston Harbor to protest the Tea Act, escalated tensions. In 1774, the Intolerable Acts coercive acts were passed by the British Parliament, which further angered the colonists and led to the formation of the First Continental Congress in 1774. The Revolution and Declaration of Independence in 1775. Fighting broke out between British troops and colonial militias at Lexington and Concord, marking the beginning of the Revolutionary War. Over the next 8 years, the colonies, led by figures like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin, fought for independence from Britain. On July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence, written primarily by Thomas Jefferson, was adopted by the Continental Congress. The document declared the colonies' independence from Britain and articulated the principles of natural rights and self-government, declaring that all men are created equal and have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The American Revolution was a struggle not just for independence, but for the creation of a new form of government. After winning the war with the help of France, the United States established a new system of government based on the principles of democracy, republicanism, and federalism, encapsulated in the U.S. Constitution of 1787 and the Bill of Rights 1791, which guaranteed individual liberties. The French Revolution, the fall of the monarchy. The French Revolution 1789-1799 was deeply influenced by the American Revolution and Enlightenment ideas. It was driven by a combination of economic hardship, social inequality, and dissatisfaction with the absolute monarchy of Louis XVI and the aristocracy's privileges. Causes of the revolution. France's economy was in a dire state due to its involvement in expensive wars, including the American Revolution, and the lavish spending of the monarchy. The tax burden fell heavily on the Third Estate, which included the peasants, urban workers, and the bourgeoisie middle class, while the First Estate clergy and Second Estate nobility were exempt from many taxes. This inequality, combined with bad harvests and widespread hunger, fueled discontent among the people. The Enlightenment had also sparked new ideas about government and society, leading many to question the authority of the king and the structure of French society. Philosophers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu inspired a desire for liberty, equality, and the rights of man. The revolution unfolds in 1789. King Louis XVI called the Estates General to address the financial crisis. However, The Third Estate, feeling underrepresented, declared itself the National Assembly and vowed to create a new constitution. After being locked out of their meeting hall, they met on the tennis court and swore the tennis court oath, vowing not to disband until they had created a constitution. The storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, marked the symbolic beginning of the revolution. The French people, enraged by the monarchy's refusal to reform, attacked the Bastille, a royal prison, and freed prisoners. The National Assembly began working on a new constitution, which led to the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, outlining principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The revolution became more radical with the rise of the Jacobins, led by Maximilien Robespierre, who sought to secure the revolution by eliminating counter-revolutionary elements. The execution of Louis XV and Marie Antoinette in 1793 marked the end of the monarchy. This period, known as the Reign of Terror, saw mass executions by the guillotine as the government sought to protect the revolution from internal and external threats. The revolution eventually led to the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, who took power in a coup d'état in 1799 and declared himself emperor, ending the revolution but preserving many of its key principles in the Napoleonic Code. The Latin American revolutions inspired by the American and French revolutions. The Latin American revolutions in the early 19th century sought independence from European colonial powers and the establishment of republics based on democratic ideals. The Haitian Revolution 1791-1804 was the first successful slave revolt in history, leading to the independence of Haiti from France. It inspired other movements for independence across Latin America. Key figures in revolutions. The Mexican War of Independence 1810-1821 was led by Miguel Hidalgo, a priest who rallied the masses against Spanish colonial rule. Though Hidalgo was executed, the struggle continued under leaders like José María Morelos and Auguste and de Iturbide, eventually leading to Mexico's independence. In South America, Simón Bolívar became the most prominent leader of independence movements. Bolívar, known as the Liberator, led the Venezuelan, Colombian, Ecuadorian, and Peruvian revolutions, creating the Gran Colombia Republic. José de San Martín led the fight for independence in Argentina, Chile, and Peru. The success of these revolutions led to the eventual independence of most Latin American countries, though they faced political instability, economic struggles, and social inequalities that persisted long after independence was achieved. The spread of revolutionary ideals. The Age of Revolutions spread beyond Europe and the Americas. The ideas of liberty, equality, and the right to self-determination became key elements in political movements across the globe. Nationalism, the belief that people with a common identity should have their own nation, became a driving force behind independence movements in Europe and later in Asia and Africa. In Europe, nationalist movements led to the unification of Italy and Germany in the mid-19th century. The Italian unification was led by figures like Giuseppe Garibaldi and Count Cavour, while Otto von Bismarck masterminded the unification of Germany through war and diplomacy. These movements were part of the broader trend of nation-state formation, which reshaped the political landscape of Europe. The legacy of the revolutions. The Age of Revolutions had a lasting impact on world history. It led to the spread of democratic principles, the rise of republics, and the challenge to monarchies and empires. The revolutions also led to the rise of republicanism, the expansion of human rights, and the spread of nationalism and socialism in the 19th and 20th centuries. While the revolutionaries often faced challenges in achieving their ideals, the political and social changes that resulted from these uprisings laid the foundation for the modern political systems of democracy, republicanism, and human rights. The impact of the French Revolution and the Latin American revolutions continues to shape political movements and struggles for independence today. The spread of industrialization across Europe and the United States. By the mid-19th century, industrialization had spread beyond Britain to Europe, the United States, and parts of Asia. While the pace and nature of industrialization varied from region to region, certain key features of industrial development such as the use of steam power, the rise of factories, and the expansion of railroads were common across industrialized nations. The United States. In the United States, industrialization was driven by immigration, an abundance of natural resources, and the development of key inventions such as the telegraph by Samuel Morse and the steam engine. The construction of railroads played a major role in connecting different regions of the country, and the Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, helped facilitate the movement of goods and people across the vast American landscape. The factories of the Northeast and the Midwest became centers of industrial production, particularly in textiles, iron, steel, and machinery. Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller emerged as the leading industrialists of the era, dominating the steel and oil industries, respectively. Their business empires represented the consolidation of wealth and power in the hands of a few individuals, fueling debates over capitalism, monopoly, and corporate regulation. The United States also saw a rise in labor unions as workers fought for better wages, working conditions, and the right to organize. The American Federation of Labor (AFL), founded in 1886, became a major force in advocating for workers' rights and collective bargaining. Germany and France also underwent industrial revolutions during the 19th century, although Germany was a latecomer compared to Britain and the U.S. After the unification of Germany in 1871, the country quickly became an industrial power, with rapid advancements in the chemical and electrical industries. Krupp in steel production and Siemens in electrical engineering were key players in this transformation. In France, industrialization was slower, and the country remained more agricultural compared to Britain or Germany. However, the Second Industrial Revolution in France saw the rise of new industries, including automobiles with companies like Peugeot, and innovations in the chemical industry. Industrialization in Russia and Japan. Russia's industrialization began later than in Western Europe and was constrained by the country's autocratic monarchy, vast rural population, and lack of an industrial infrastructure. However, under Tsar Nicholas II in the late 19th century, Russia began to embrace industrialization. The construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway, completed in 1904, connected eastern Russia with the western industrial heartland, facilitating the movement of goods and people. While industrialization in Russia was limited by the vast size of the country and its reliance on serf labor, the growth of cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow created new social and political tensions. The working class faced harsh conditions, and there were frequent strikes and protests, which would eventually contribute to the Russian Revolution of 1917. Japan. In contrast to Russia, Japan embraced industrialization in the late 19th century through a process of westernization and modernization. Following the Meiji Restoration of 1868, Japan sought to rapidly industrialize to catch up with the Western powers. The Japanese government implemented reforms in education, transportation, and industry, encouraging the growth of factories and the development of heavy industries like shipbuilding, textiles, and iron production. By the turn of the 20th century, Japan had become a major industrial power and expanded its influence in East Asia through imperialism and military conquest, notably in Korea and Manchuria. The global expansion of trade and the age of imperialism. As industrialization spread globally, the demand for raw materials such as rubber, cotton, oil, and minerals led to the expansion of global trade. European powers, the United States, and Japan sought new markets and resources to fuel their growing industries. This led to the rise of imperialism, as industrialized nations began to establish colonies around the world, particularly in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. European imperialism. The scramble for Africa in the late 19th century saw European powers Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, and others divide the African continent into colonies for economic exploitation. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 formalized European control over much of Africa, with little regard for the indigenous populations. The exploitation of resources, including ivory, rubber, and mineral wealth, fueled European industrialization, but also led to brutal colonial practices and the degradation of local cultures and societies. British Empire and the Opium Wars. The British Empire expanded significantly during this period, with colonies in India, Australia, and Africa becoming key suppliers of raw materials. The British also established an opium trade in China to balance their trade deficit with the Chinese. The Opium Wars 1839–1842 and 1856–1860 resulted in the Treaty of Nanking, which forced China to open several ports to British trade and ceded Hong Kong to Britain. U.S. imperialism. The United States emerged as an imperial power at the end of the 19th century, with the acquisition of territories such as the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Hawaii, following the Spanish-American War 1898. This marked the beginning of the U.S. role in global politics and imperialism, although its expansionist policies were often justified under the rhetoric of spreading democracy and civilization. The social impact of industrialization. The rise of industrialization brought dramatic changes to social structures. The growth of cities led to the rise of the urban working class and new patterns of class division. The bourgeoisie middle class, including factory owners, managers, and professionals, grew in wealth and influence, while the proletariat working class faced harsh conditions in the factories and slums of rapidly growing cities. Living and working conditions. Living conditions in industrial cities were often deplorable, with overcrowded slums, poor sanitation, and inadequate housing. Child labor was widespread, and factory workers often worked long hours in dangerous conditions for low wages. The rise of the labor movement in the 19th century, with the formation of unions and strikes, led to calls for better wages, working hours, and conditions. Women in the workforce. The Industrial Revolution also had a significant impact on gender roles. Women, particularly from the working class, entered the workforce in large numbers, especially in textile mills, factories, and garment shops. Although women were often paid less than men for the same work, their participation in the workforce marked a significant shift in social dynamics. In the middle class, women's roles remained largely confined to the home, though the growth of industrial society led to changes in education and access to public life. The women's suffrage movement gained momentum during the 19th century, with women in countries like the United States and Britain campaigning for the right to vote. The legacy of industrialization. The Industrial Revolution profoundly shaped the modern world, leading to the rise of industrial economies and the global spread of capitalism. It set the stage for the development of modern nation-states, democracy, and imperialism, while also leading to the growth of global trade and the establishment of a global economy. However, it also brought about stark inequalities, especially in the industrialized nations, and led to the exploitation of resources and people, particularly in the colonies. The labor movement, social reform movements, and the rise of socialism in the 19th century were responses to the negative impacts of industrialization. The legacy of industrialization can still be felt today in the form of global trade, urbanization, environmental challenges, and the ongoing debate over the balance between economic growth and social justice. The causes and outbreak of World War I. World War I was a global conflict that began in Europe in 1914 and involved many of the world's major powers. The war is often seen as a result of multiple interwoven factors, including nationalism, imperialism, militarism, and alliances between European powers. The alliance system and militarism. In the decades leading up to the war, European powers had formed a complex network of military alliances. On one side, the Triple Alliance consisted of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, though Italy would later switch sides. On the other side, the Triple Entente was formed between France, Russia, and Britain. These alliances were intended to deter conflict, but, in reality, created a system where a local conflict could quickly escalate into a broader war. The rise of militarism. The belief that a country should maintain a strong military and be prepared to use it aggressively was also a factor. Nations like Germany were building up their armies and navies, creating an arms race, particularly in the North Sea and on land in Europe. Nationalism and imperialism. Nationalism, particularly in the Balkans, played a significant role in stoking tensions. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary by a Serbian nationalist in Sarajevo in 1914 acted as a spark for the conflict. Austria-Hungary, with the backing of Germany, declared war on Serbia. This act triggered a cascade of events as Russia, an ally of Serbia, mobilized its forces, leading to the involvement of other countries in the alliance system. Meanwhile, imperialist rivalries over colonies and resources also contributed to the tension between European powers, particularly between Germany and Britain over control of colonies in Africa and Asia. The war breaks out within days of the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. The war escalated, with Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia. Russia mobilized its army to defend Serbia, leading Germany to declare war on Russia. Germany then declared war on France, and soon Britain entered the war after Germany invaded Belgium in violation of Belgian neutrality. By the end of the summer of 1914, much of Europe was engaged in what would become World War I. The major fronts and key battles of World War I was fought primarily on two fronts, the Western Front and the Eastern Front, with significant battles and campaigns also occurring in the Middle East and Africa. The Western Front saw a bloody stalemate that lasted for most of the war. The fighting took place mainly in France and Belgium, where trenches were dug on both sides, creating a trench warfare system. The conditions in the trenches were horrendous, with soldiers facing constant danger from enemy fire, disease, and harsh weather conditions. Key battles on the Western Front included the Battle of the Somme 1916, one of the bloodiest battles in history, with over 1 million casualties. The battle was intended to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun and break the German lines, but it resulted in heavy losses for both sides without a decisive breakthrough. The Battle of Verdun 1916, another massive battle on the Western Front, where the French defended against a German offensive. It became a symbol of French determination, but also resulted in heavy casualties. The Battle of Ypres 1914, 1915, and 1917, a series of battles where chemical weapons, including chlorine gas, were used for the first time in warfare. The Eastern Front was much more fluid than the Western Front, with larger distances between the opposing armies. Germany and Austria-Hungary fought against Russia, and later, Romania and Italy would join the conflict on the side of the Allies. Key battles here were the Brusilov Offensive 1916, where Russian forces made significant gains against the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Battle of Tannenberg 1914, a decisive victory for Germany against Russia that effectively destroyed the Russian Second Army. While the Western Front was defined by entrenched positions and a stalemate, the Eastern Front was more dynamic, with massive battles and shifting borders as both sides tried to gain control of vast territories. Global involvement. The war was truly global, with British colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific involved in supporting the Allies. Japan, allied with Britain, seized German territories in China and the Pacific. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire, which sided with the Central Powers, fought against the Allies in the Middle East, North Africa, and the Caucasus. The end of World War and its aftermath. After 4 years of brutal conflict, World War I finally came to an end in 1918. The war left Europe in ruins, with millions dead and entire regions destroyed. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, officially ended the war. The treaty imposed harsh penalties on Germany, including heavy reparations, the loss of territory, and restrictions on its military capabilities. The impact of the war led to the collapse of several empires, including the Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian, and German empires. New nations were created in their place, including Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Poland. The Russian Revolution of 1917 had already brought the Bolsheviks to power, leading to the establishment of the Soviet Union in 1922. The aftermath of the war also saw the rise of fascism and communism in Europe, as political instability and economic hardship led to the rise of extremist ideologies. World War II, the rise of totalitarian regimes. World War II 1939-1945 was a direct consequence of the unresolved issues from World War I and the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The rise of totalitarian regimes in Germany under Adolf Hitler, Italy under Benito Mussolini, and Japan set the stage for the outbreak of the Second Global Conflict. The causes of World War II. The Treaty of Versailles, which had ended World War I, left Germany economically weakened and politically unstable. Hitler's Nazi Party capitalized on this dissatisfaction, and, in 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. His aggressive expansionist policies and desire to reverse the humiliation of Germany after World War led to the invasion of Poland in 1939, which triggered the outbreak of World War II. Germany's invasion of Poland was followed by the invasion of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, marking the beginning of the war in Europe. In the Pacific, Japan had already been expanding its empire by invading Manchuria in 1931 and later China in 1937. Major events and battles. The war in Europe saw major events such as the Battle of Britain 1940, where Britain successfully defended against German air raids, and the invasion of Normandy D-Day in 1944, which led to the liberation of France and the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. On the Eastern Front, the Battle of Stalingrad 1942-1943 marked a turning point as the Soviet Union pushed back against the German invasion. In the Pacific, Pearl Harbor, a surprise attack by Japan on the U.S. naval base in Hawaii in 1941, led the United States to enter the war. Major Pacific battles such as Midway 1942 and Iwo Jima 1945 brought the Allies closer to victory in the Pacific. The Holocaust. One of the darkest aspects of World War II was the Holocaust, the systematic, state-sponsored persecution and genocide of 6 million Jews and millions of others, including Roma, disabled individuals, political dissidents, and other minority groups, by Nazi Germany. The Holocaust remains one of the most horrific events in human history. The end of World War II and the emergence of the United States and the Soviet Union as superpowers. World War II ended in 1945 with the unconditional surrender of Germany in May and the surrender of Japan in September after the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Post-war reconstruction. The war had completely reshaped the global order. In Europe, the European Union, then the European Coal and Steel Community, began to take shape as a means to foster economic cooperation and prevent future conflict. The Marshall Plan, an American initiative to provide aid to rebuild Europe, was a key factor in the reconstruction of the European economy. The Cold War. After World War II, the world divided into two main spheres of influence: the United States and the Soviet Union. These two superpowers engaged in the Cold War, a period of political and military tension between the capitalist West and the communist East that lasted for much of the 20th century. The United Nations was established in 1945 to promote international cooperation and prevent future wars. The legacy of the World Wars. The World Wars had profound consequences that shaped the modern world. The creation of international organizations like the United Nations and the rise of superpowers like the United States and the Soviet Union marked the beginning of a new era of global politics. The wars also accelerated technological development, including in medicine, communication, and military technology. However, the wars also left lasting scars, including the destruction of cities, the genocides committed during World War II, and the division of Europe into East and West during the Cold War. The legacy of the World Wars continues to influence global politics, economics, and society today. The legacy of the World Wars. The origins of the Cold War. The origins of the Cold War can be traced to the aftermath of World War II, which left the United States and the Soviet Union as the two dominant global powers. However, These two superpowers had fundamentally different ideologies. The United States was a capitalist democracy, while the Soviet Union was a communist dictatorship under the leadership of Joseph Stalin. The wartime alliance between the two countries was built on necessity, not ideological unity, and tensions between them quickly escalated after the defeat of Nazi Germany. Ideological differences. The United States, along with its Western allies, promoted a world order based on capitalism, democracy, and individual freedoms. The U.S. was committed to spreading these values through mechanisms like the Marshall Plan, which offered economic aid to rebuild Western Europe and prevent the spread of communism. The Soviet Union, led by Stalin, advocated for communism, where the government controlled the economy and society was organized around collective ownership. The USSR sought to spread Marxist-Leninist ideology globally and to secure a sphere of influence over Eastern Europe. Key events leading to the Cold War. The Yalta Conference, February 1945. Allied leaders, including Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, met to discuss the post-war order. Although agreements were made to divide Germany into occupation zones, tensions over the fate of Eastern Europe and the future of Poland foreshadowed the ideological divide between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The Potsdam Conference, July-August 1945. Following Roosevelt's death, the new American president, Harry Truman, met with Stalin and Churchill. The disagreement over the control of Eastern Europe, particularly the Soviet-imposed communist governments in the region, deepened the divide. The atomic bomb was also a factor, as the U.S. used the threat of nuclear weapons to assert its influence. The early Cold War, 1947-1953. The Cold War took shape in the immediate aftermath of World War II. The first major confrontation between the U.S. and the Soviet Union came through the Truman Doctrine 1947, which aimed to contain the spread of communism by providing support to countries at risk of communist takeover, particularly in Greece and Turkey. This marked the beginning of containment as the core strategy of the United States. The Marshall Plan in 1948. The U.S. launched the Marshall Plan, a massive aid package that offered economic assistance to rebuild Western European countries devastated by the war. The plan aimed to create stable democracies and prevent the spread of Soviet influence in these countries. The Soviet Union rejected the plan for its satellite states and instead established its own economic system in the Eastern Bloc, leading to the further division of Europe. The Berlin blockade and airlift in 1948. The Soviet Union imposed a blockade on Berlin, which was located deep within the Soviet-controlled zone of East Germany. The blockade aimed to force the Allies to abandon their sectors in the city. But the U.S. responded by launching the Berlin airlift, a massive operation in which American and British planes supplied West Berlin with food, fuel, and supplies for nearly a year. The success of the airlift symbolized Western resolve and the beginning of Cold War tensions in Germany. The Korean War, 1950-1953. In 1950, the Korean War erupted when North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and China, invaded South Korea, which was supported by the United States and the United Nations. The war ended in a stalemate in 1953, with Korea remaining divided along the 38th parallel. The conflict highlighted the global nature of the Cold War, as both superpowers engaged in a proxy war, and it set the stage for the arms race and military alliances that would dominate the Cold War. The Cold War intensifies 1953-1962. After the death of Stalin in 1953, the Soviet Union was under the leadership of Nikita Khrushchev. Tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union escalated during this period, with several key events heightening the risk of direct conflict. The space race. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite, into orbit. This event sparked the space race between the U.S. and the USSR as both superpowers competed for technological and scientific supremacy. The launch of Sputnik was a significant psychological blow to the United States, prompting President Dwight D. Eisenhower and his successor, John F. Kennedy, to commit significant resources to developing American space technology. The Apollo program eventually led to the U.S. landing the first man on the moon in 1969. The Cuban Missile Crisis 1962, perhaps the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, came in 1962, when the Soviet Union deployed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the U.S. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, as U.S. President John F. Kennedy demanded the removal of the missiles. After a tense 13-day standoff, the Soviets agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba and the secret removal of U.S. missiles from Turkey. The crisis highlighted the dangers of the Cold War and led to the establishment of the hotline between Washington and Moscow to facilitate direct communication in times of crisis. The Cold War in the 1970s and 1982's detente, and the Soviet-Afghan War in the 1970s. The U.S. and the Soviet Union moved toward detente, or the easing of tensions, as both superpowers realized the dangers of nuclear confrontation. The Strategic Arms Limitation talks SALT resulted in agreements to limit the number of nuclear weapons held by each country. However, detente began to unravel with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, which was seen by the U.S. as an expansion of Soviet influence in the Middle East. The U.S. responded by boycotting the 1980 Summer Olympics in Moscow and increasing support for Afghan rebels, the Mujahideen, which contributed to the Soviet Union's eventual military and economic failure in Afghanistan. Reagan and the Cold War revival. In the 1980s, U.S. President Ronald Reagan adopted a more aggressive stance against the Soviet Union, calling it the evil empire and increasing military spending. The Strategic Defense Initiative (SDI), a missile defense program, was introduced, further escalating tensions. Reagan's approach, along with growing Soviet economic troubles, contributed to the revival of Cold War rivalries. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was facing severe economic stagnation and political turmoil. Mikhail Gorbachev, who became the leader of the Soviet Union in 1985, introduced a series of reforms known as glasnost openness and perestroika restructuring in an attempt to revitalize the country. However, these reforms unintentionally weakened the power of the Communist Party and led to increasing demands for political freedom. The fall of the Berlin Wall 1989 in 1989. The Berlin Wall, the symbol of the division between East and West, was torn down, as East Germany opened its borders and allowed its citizens to cross into West Germany. This marked the beginning of the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. The end of the Soviet Union 1991 in 1991. Following a failed coup against Gorbachev and mounting pressure from nationalist movements within the republics, the Soviet Union dissolved. The Cold War officially ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the former Soviet republics became independent nations. Boris Yeltsin became the first president of Russia, and the global political landscape shifted dramatically. The legacy of the Cold War. The Cold War had a lasting impact on the global order. It reshaped international relations, leading to the creation of NATO North Atlantic Treaty Organization as a military alliance for the West and the Warsaw Pact as a counterbalance for the Eastern Bloc. The conflict also contributed to the spread of nuclear weapons and led to a global arms race, raising the stakes for global security. The collapse of the Soviet Union ushered in a new era of unipolarity, with the United States emerging as the dominant superpower. However, regional conflicts, such as the wars in the Middle East, Africa, and Eastern Europe, continued to reflect the lingering impact of Cold War alliances and rivalries. The end of the Cold War also contributed to the rise of new economic systems, as former communist countries transitioned to market economies, and the spread of democracy became a central focus of U.S. foreign policy. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. The dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the official end of the Cold War, and the beginning of a new era in world politics. The United States emerged as the dominant global power, and the world was no longer divided into two hostile blocs. Boris Yeltsin, the first president of Russia, presided over the collapse of the Soviet system, and the 15 Soviet republics became independent nations. The former Warsaw Pact countries and Eastern European nations began transitioning from communist to market-based economies and democratic political systems. The end of the Cold War also led to the reunification of Germany in 1990, as East Germany joined the Federal Republic of Germany. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 symbolized the end of the division of Europe, and the European Union (EU) began to expand, integrating former communist states into a broader political and economic system. The rise of globalization. In the years following the Cold War, the world experienced an unprecedented wave of globalization, driven by the expansion of international trade, the growth of multinational corporations, and the rapid spread of information technology. Economic globalization. Economic globalization refers to the increasing interconnectedness of the world's economies, with goods, services, and capital flowing across borders at unprecedented rates. The World Trade Organization (WTO), established in 1995, became a key institution in overseeing and regulating international trade, promoting free trade agreements, and reducing tariffs. Free trade agreements such as NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, and the expansion of the European Union facilitated the movement of goods, services, and labor across international borders. Technological advancements. The rise of information technology and the Internet was one of the defining features of globalization. The development of personal computers, mobile phones, and the Internet revolutionized communication, allowing individuals, businesses, and governments to connect in ways that were previously unimaginable. The dot-com bubble of the late 1990s symbolized the rapid growth of the tech industry and the new digital economy. Multinational corporations. As trade barriers fell and communication technologies improved, multinational corporations (MNCs) became global players, operating in multiple countries and contributing to the rapid spread of capitalism and consumer culture. Major corporations like McDonald's, Coca-Cola, Apple, and Nike expanded their operations worldwide, shaping global consumer preferences and creating a more interconnected world economy. The challenges of the post-Cold War era. While the end of the Cold War ushered in a period of relative peace and economic growth, the world was not without challenges. Issues such as regional conflicts, ethnic tensions, terrorism, and climate change began to shape global events and relations. Regional conflicts. Even though the Cold War had ended, regional conflicts and civil wars continued to erupt, often fueled by ethnic, religious, and political tensions. The Balkans saw significant upheaval in the 1990s, with the Yugoslav wars resulting in the breakup of Yugoslavia and widespread violence, particularly the genocide in Bosnia and the conflict in Kosovo. The Rwandan genocide 1994 further highlighted the dangers of ethnic conflict in Africa, as Hutus and Tutsis clashed, leading to the deaths of over 800,000 people. The rise of terrorism in the 1990s and early 2000s. Terrorism became one of the most significant global threats. The Islamic extremist group Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, carried out high-profile attacks, including the 1998 U.S. embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania. However, the most devastating act of terrorism occurred on September 11, 2001, when Al-Qaeda operatives hijacked 4 commercial airplanes and carried out suicide attacks on the World Trade Center in New York City and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. The attacks killed nearly 3,000 people and sparked the War on Terror, including the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 and the Iraq War in 2003. The Iraq War 2003. The Iraq War, led by the United States and its allies, was launched in 2003 under the premise that Saddam Hussein's regime was harboring weapons of mass destruction (WMDs), although no such weapons were found. The war led to the overthrow of Saddam Hussein's government, but also created instability in the region and led to the rise of Islamic State ISIS, a radical jihadist group that would go on to control large parts of Iraq and Syria. The changing global order. The emergence of China. One of the most significant developments in the post-Cold War era has been the rise of China as a global economic and political power. After the economic reforms of Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s, China opened up to foreign investment and integrated into the global economy. By the 2000s, China had become the world's second-largest economy, benefiting from its role as the world's factory due to its vast labor force and manufacturing capacity. China's global influence continues to grow, with its Belt and Road Initiative aimed at building infrastructure and increasing trade links across Asia, Africa, and Europe. The European Union (EU), originally formed as the European Economic Community (EEC) in the 1950s, grew in influence and scope after the Cold War. In 1993, the Maastricht Treaty formally established the European Union, and it introduced the euro currency in 1999. The EU has become a major political and economic union, promoting trade, democracy, and human rights, though it also faces challenges, such as economic disparities between member states, immigration issues, and the aftermath of the Brexit referendum 2016, in which the United Kingdom voted to leave the EU. The War on Terror and the global response. Following the September 11th attacks, the War on Terror became a central focus of global politics. The U.S. led the charge in countering terrorism, which included military interventions, intelligence operations, and diplomatic efforts. The Patriot Act in the U.S. expanded government surveillance powers, while international organizations like NATO and the United Nations were involved in peacekeeping missions and counterterrorism efforts. The global impact of these actions has been profound, with increased security measures at airports, heightened surveillance, and ongoing debates about the balance between security and civil liberties. The future of globalization and the new challenges of the 21st century. While the post-Cold War era saw the rapid spread of globalization, the 21st century has brought new challenges. Issues such as climate change, resource depletion, pandemics, and the rise of populism have created complex political, economic, and social challenges. Climate change and environmental issues. Climate change is one of the most pressing issues of the 21st century, with rising global temperatures, extreme weather events, and environmental degradation threatening ecosystems and human populations. Efforts to address climate change, such as the Paris Agreement 2015, aim to limit global warming and promote sustainable development, but political disagreements and economic interests have complicated global cooperation. Technological advancements and artificial intelligence. Advancements in artificial intelligence (AI), automation, and biotechnology have the potential to revolutionize economies and societies. However, these technologies also raise ethical concerns, including the impact on employment, privacy, and security. The ongoing digital revolution is reshaping how people live, work, and interact, while also raising new questions about the role of technology in society. A new global order. The post-Cold War era has been defined by the rise of new global powers, the spread of globalization, and the rise of new challenges and conflicts. As the world becomes increasingly interconnected, the need for international cooperation, conflict resolution, and sustainable development has never been greater. The future remains uncertain, but the events of the 20th and 21st centuries continue to shape the world in profound ways. The rise of China and shifting global power dynamics. In the 21st century, China has emerged as a major global power, challenging the long-standing dominance of the United States in many areas, particularly economic influence and military power. China's rise has significantly altered the geopolitical landscape, with implications for trade, diplomacy, and global governance. China's economic growth. China's rapid economic growth, particularly since the 1990s when the country embraced market reforms under Deng Xiaoping, has turned it into the world's second-largest economy. The country has become a global manufacturing hub, often referred to as the world's factory, producing goods that are sold all over the world. Its growing middle class is also driving increased consumption and innovation, positioning China as a dominant player in the global market. In recent years, China has moved beyond manufacturing to focus on high-tech industries, including artificial intelligence (AI), renewable energy, and 5G telecommunications. Through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative (BRI), China has sought to expand its economic and political influence in Asia, Africa, and Europe by investing in infrastructure and creating new trade routes. Geopolitical rivalries. China's growing influence has caused concern, particularly in the United States and its allies. Tensions have been rising over trade imbalances, intellectual property rights, and China's increasing military presence in the South China Sea, a region of vital strategic and economic importance. In 2020, the U.S.-China trade war resulted in tariffs and sanctions, further escalating tensions. The China-Russia partnership, while not a formal alliance, has been a significant development in global politics. The two countries share common interests in countering U.S. influence, particularly in regions like the Middle East and Central Asia. The future of U.S.-China relations. As China continues to grow in power, the future of its relationship with the United States will be a central issue in global politics. Will the two superpowers cooperate, compete, or potentially clash in a new Cold War-style rivalry? The answer will likely determine the future trajectory of global political and economic dynamics. Climate change. The global environmental crisis, one of the most pressing challenges of the 21st century, is climate change. The scientific consensus is clear: human activity, particularly the burning of fossil fuels, has led to a dramatic increase in global temperatures, rising sea levels, and increasingly extreme weather events. The impact of climate change. The effects of climate change are already being felt worldwide, with countries experiencing more frequent and severe heat waves, floods, droughts, and wildfires. Coastal cities, such as Miami, New York, and Shanghai, are facing the threat of rising sea levels, which could lead to millions of people being displaced. In addition to environmental disruptions, climate change also has economic consequences. Agricultural sectors in many countries are facing declining yields due to changing weather patterns, while rising insurance costs from extreme weather events are putting a strain on economies. Global supply chains are increasingly vulnerable to environmental disruptions, with impacts on everything from food production to technology manufacturing. International climate agreements. Efforts to combat climate change have led to several international agreements, the most significant of which is the Paris Agreement, adopted in 2015. Under the Paris Agreement, almost every nation agreed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and work toward limiting global temperature rise to well below to sea above pre-industrial levels, with efforts to limit the rise to 1.5 C. However, many nations have struggled to meet their emissions reduction targets, and political divisions over the cost of climate action continue to hinder global cooperation. Countries like the United States have vacillated in their commitment to climate agreements, while China and India have faced criticism for their increasing emissions despite calls for them to adopt stricter climate policies. The path forward. The future of climate action depends on global cooperation and the urgent need for nations to transition to renewable energy sources, improve energy efficiency, and invest in technologies like carbon capture and electric vehicles. The goal of limiting global warming is ambitious, but climate science has made clear that immediate action is necessary to avoid irreversible environmental damage, global health crises, the COVID-19 pandemic, and beyond. The outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2019 and its global impact highlighted the interconnectedness of the world and the vulnerabilities of the global health system. The pandemic has raised critical questions about public health, global cooperation, and the preparedness of nations to handle future health crises. The impact of COVID-19 caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus, rapidly spread across the globe, leading to millions of infections and deaths. The pandemic overwhelmed healthcare systems, disrupted economies, and forced widespread lockdowns. Nations scrambled to secure medical supplies, develop vaccines, and implement public health measures to curb the spread of the virus. The pandemic also exacerbated existing inequalities, as poorer countries and disadvantaged communities had less access to medical care and vaccines. The global economy faced significant downturns, with job losses, business closures, and increased poverty in many regions. Vaccine distribution and global response. While vaccines were developed at unprecedented speed, the global distribution of vaccines was uneven. Wealthier nations secured large quantities of vaccines, while low and middle-income countries struggled to access vaccines for their populations. International efforts like COVAX have sought to provide equitable vaccine distribution, but challenges remain. The pandemic response has also highlighted the importance of international cooperation in addressing global health threats. Global organizations like the World Health Organization (WHO) and the United Nations have been instrumental in coordinating responses, but the pandemic underscored the need for more robust global health systems and preparedness for future crises. Future health challenges. As the world recovers from COVID-19, it faces ongoing health challenges, including the rise of antimicrobial resistance (AMR), the threat of new pandemics, and the need to address non-communicable diseases like heart disease and diabetes. Global health governance and equitable access to healthcare will be central to managing these challenges. Technology and the digital revolution. The 21st century has seen the rise of transformative technologies that have reshaped society, from artificial intelligence (AI) and automation to biotechnology and digital communication. Artificial intelligence and automation, AI and automation, are set to revolutionize industries across the globe, from manufacturing to healthcare. The rise of AI has led to significant advances in areas like robotics, machine learning, and natural language processing, while automation has the potential to dramatically increase productivity. However, these technologies also raise concerns about job displacement, privacy, and ethical dilemmas. The digital economy. The digital economy has transformed business models and the way people interact. E-commerce, social media, and digital platforms have created new economic opportunities and challenges. However, the rise of digital giants like Google, Facebook, and Amazon has raised questions about monopolies, data privacy, and the role of big tech in shaping public discourse. Cybersecurity and privacy. As the digital world expands, cybersecurity becomes a critical issue. With increasing amounts of personal and financial data online, nations and individuals face growing threats from cyberattacks, data breaches, and surveillance. Data privacy and digital rights are becoming central concerns for policymakers and citizens alike. Nationalism, populism, and global political tensions. In recent years, nationalism and populism have surged in many parts of the world, challenging traditional democratic institutions and international cooperation. Leaders with populist agendas, such as Donald Trump in the United States, Viktor Orbán in Hungary, and Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, have advocated for national sovereignty and anti-globalization policies. The rise of nationalism. Nationalist movements, often fueled by concerns about immigration, economic inequality, and a backlash against globalism, have reshaped political landscapes in countries around the world. In Europe, Brexit. The United Kingdom's decision to leave the European Union exemplified the rising tide of nationalism, as many British citizens voted to regain control over immigration and trade policies. Populist movements. Populist leaders have capitalized on frustration with traditional elites, often using anti-establishment rhetoric and focusing on issues like economic inequality and national identity. While some populist movements have led to political instability, they have also sparked debates about democracy, free speech, and the future of international cooperation. The path forward. The challenges of the 21st century are vast and interconnected. From climate change and global health crises to the rise of China and the digital revolution, the world faces complex problems that require international cooperation, innovation, and adaptation. The future remains uncertain, but the actions taken today will shape the world for generations to come. The rise of emerging powers. The rise of emerging powers marks a shift from a unipolar world dominated by the United States to a more multipolar world, where countries in the global south are gaining greater economic, political, and strategic influence. China's global ambitions. China has emerged as one of the most significant emerging powers in the 21st century. Since the economic reforms of the 1970s, China has transformed itself into the world's second-largest economy, and its influence continues to grow. Under the leadership of Xi Jinping, China has pursued ambitious initiatives to enhance its global power, such as the Belt and Road Initiative (BRI), which aims to invest in infrastructure projects across Asia, Africa, and Europe. China's economic influence has been coupled with an expansion of its military capabilities and a growing role in global institutions such as the United Nations and the World Trade Organization (WTO). The country's rise has sparked tensions with the United States, especially over issues such as trade, intellectual property, and territorial disputes in the South China Sea. India's growing influence. India, with its large population, booming economy, and rapidly expanding technological sector, is another major emerging power. India has become a key player in the global economy, particularly in information technology and services. The country has also made strides in space exploration, military modernization, and geopolitical influence, especially within the Indo-Pacific region. India's foreign policy is centered around promoting democracy, economic growth, and regional stability, but it also faces internal challenges such as poverty, inequality, and religious tensions. India's role in global governance is expanding, particularly through partnerships with countries like the United States, Japan, and Australia, as well as its growing influence in multilateral organizations like the United Nations and the World Health Organization (WHO). Brazil and regional leadership. Brazil, the largest economy in South America, has played a leading role in regional politics and diplomacy. As a member of the BRICS group, which also includes Russia, India, China, and South Africa, Brazil has sought to promote multilateralism and economic development. While facing challenges related to political instability, deforestation, and inequality, Brazil remains an important voice for the global South, particularly in climate change negotiations and trade agreements. The evolution of global institutions. As the international system evolves, there is growing recognition that global governance institutions must adapt to new realities. The existing structures of power formed in the aftermath of World War II are increasingly seen as outdated and insufficient to address the complex challenges of the 21st century. This section will examine how global institutions are changing and the ongoing debate over reform. The United Nations and peacekeeping. The United Nations (UN), founded in 1945, remains the most important global institution for international diplomacy, peacekeeping, and development. However, the UN faces criticism for its inability to effectively address conflicts, particularly in the Middle East, Africa, and Eastern Europe. The Security Council, with its permanent members including the US, Russia, China, France, and the United Kingdom, has been criticized for its lack of representation and the veto power of the 5 permanent members, which often leads to gridlock. In recent years, the UN has made efforts to adapt to global challenges such as climate change and human rights, but its peacekeeping missions have often been underfunded, under-resourced, and unable to resolve deep-rooted conflicts. The rise of regional powers has also led to calls for reforming the Security Council to better reflect the world's changing power dynamics. The World Trade Organization and global trade. The World Trade Organization (WTO) has played a crucial role in regulating global trade, promoting free markets, and resolving disputes between countries. However, the WTO has faced significant challenges in recent years. The rise of protectionism, especially from major economies like the United States and China, has undermined its effectiveness. The WTO's failure to successfully conclude the Doha Development Round of trade negotiations, focused on reducing barriers for developing countries, has led to a crisis of credibility. Additionally, the increasing complexity of global trade, including issues like intellectual property and digital trade, has prompted calls for reform of the WTO and the creation of new frameworks to address the changing nature of commerce in the 21st century. The International Monetary Fund and Global Economic Governance, the International Monetary Fund (IMF) and the World Bank, are key institutions in managing global financial stability and development. However, both organizations have faced criticism for their governance structures, which are heavily influenced by Western powers, and for their handling of financial crises, particularly in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Calls for reforming these institutions to give emerging powers more say in global economic governance have intensified in recent years. The rise of cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology also presents new challenges to traditional global financial systems. While these innovations have the potential to increase financial inclusion and reduce transaction costs, they also raise concerns about regulation, security, and their potential to disrupt existing financial institutions. Global challenges and the need for cooperation. The 21st century has introduced a host of global challenges that no country or institution can address alone. The interconnected nature of issues like climate change, cybersecurity, pandemics, and global inequality means that nations must work together to find solutions. Climate change and sustainable development. One of the most pressing challenges of the 21st century is climate change. Despite international agreements like the Paris Agreement, global emissions continue to rise, and many nations are struggling to meet their environmental commitments. The consequences of climate change, such as rising sea levels, extreme weather events, and resource scarcity, have the potential to destabilize regions, increase migration, and exacerbate existing conflicts. Sustainable development, which balances economic growth with environmental protection and social equity, will be key to addressing these challenges. Global cooperation on renewable energy, climate finance, and conservation will be essential to ensuring a stable and prosperous future. Cybersecurity and the digital age. In the digital age, cybersecurity has become a major concern for governments, businesses, and individuals alike. With increasing reliance on digital systems for everything from financial transactions to healthcare to national security, the threat of cyberattacks, data breaches, and hacking is growing. International cooperation is necessary to protect critical infrastructure, prevent cybercrime, and establish global norms and regulations in the digital space. Global health and pandemics. The COVID-19 pandemic underscored the importance of global cooperation in addressing health crises. While the pandemic highlighted the weaknesses in global health systems, it also spurred international efforts to develop vaccines and improve public health infrastructure. The World Health Organization (WHO) played a crucial role in coordinating the global response, but the crisis also exposed the challenges of managing global health emergencies and ensuring equitable access to healthcare. Looking forward, the world will need robust international systems to handle future pandemics, improve health outcomes in developing countries, and address rising public health concerns like antimicrobial resistance and mental health. The future of global governance. As the world continues to evolve, the future of global governance will depend on the ability of nations to adapt to changing power dynamics and emerging challenges. Key issues will include the balance between national sovereignty and global cooperation, the reform of international institutions to reflect the rise of new powers, the need for multilateral cooperation in addressing climate change, global health, cybersecurity, and trade, the rise of populism and its impact on international relations. The future of global governance will likely be characterized by an increasingly multipolar world, where power is more distributed and the roles of regional powers, international organizations, and global institutions will become more complex. To address the pressing challenges of the 21st century, countries will need to engage in deeper collaboration, while balancing their national interests with the broader needs of global stability and prosperity. A new era of global cooperation? The 21st century presents both significant opportunities and challenges. The rise of emerging powers, the global push for sustainable development, and the ongoing struggles with cybersecurity and global health will define the future of global governance. To build a better world, nations will need to strengthen their cooperation and work together to tackle the most urgent issues facing humanity. Whether this cooperation will be a hopeful path forward or whether global fragmentation will hinder progress remains to be seen. The promise and perils of technological advancement. One of the defining features of the 21st century is the rapid pace of technological advancement. Innovations in artificial intelligence (AI), robotics, biotechnology, and renewable energy have the potential to revolutionize every aspect of society. These technologies offer incredible opportunities for improving healthcare, education, sustainability, and even human longevity. However, they also come with significant ethical, economic, and social risks. Artificial intelligence and automation. The development of AI and automation promises to reshape the global economy. While these technologies could lead to greater efficiency, innovations in medicine, and revolutionized industries, they also raise concerns about job displacement and economic inequality. As machines and algorithms take over more tasks, workers in traditional industries may be left behind. Universal Basic Income (UBI) and reskilling programs may be required to address these disruptions. Furthermore, AI raises serious ethical questions. How should we ensure that AI systems are designed to benefit society and not perpetuate biases or inequalities? Ethical frameworks will need to be established to govern AI development, ensuring that these systems are aligned with human values and societal well-being. Biotechnology and human enhancement. Biotechnological advancements have opened up new possibilities for human enhancement, from gene editing, for example, CRISPR, to the potential for life extension and biological augmentation. While these technologies could eliminate genetic diseases and improve health outcomes, they also present ethical challenges. Who gets access to these technologies? Will they exacerbate social inequality or allow for the creation of designer babies? The rapid pace of change in biotechnology will require careful regulation and international cooperation to ensure that these advancements are used responsibly. Sustainability and the future of the planet. The future of humanity is inextricably linked to the sustainability of the planet. Climate change, resource depletion, and the loss of biodiversity are among the most pressing challenges of our time. The decisions we make now will determine whether future generations can live on a planet that can support their needs. Climate change and environmental responsibility. The effects of climate change are already being felt, with rising global temperatures, extreme weather events, and environmental degradation threatening ecosystems and communities worldwide. While renewable energy technologies like solar and wind power offer hope, a global transition to a carbon-neutral economy will require massive investments in clean energy, changes in consumption patterns, and large-scale policy reforms. The question remains, can humanity act quickly enough to avoid the worst impacts of climate change? A key part of the solution will be the widespread adoption of sustainable agriculture and green technologies, which can help reduce emissions and preserve natural resources. Circular economy models, which prioritize reducing waste and reusing materials, will also play a crucial role in building a more sustainable future. Water scarcity and resource management. Water scarcity is another growing issue, as population growth, climate change, and pollution place increasing pressure on global freshwater supplies. Solutions like desalination technologies, water conservation, and improved irrigation methods will be essential to managing water resources effectively. However, the political challenges of managing water resources equitably, especially in conflict-prone regions, will require cooperation at local, national, and international levels. The changing global order, a multipolar world. The global balance of power is shifting. The United States, China, and India are emerging as the key players in the new world order, while regional powers are asserting more influence in areas like Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. This shift toward a multipolar world presents both opportunities for cooperation and risks of competition and conflict. The need for global governance. As the world becomes more interconnected, the need for effective global governance is clearer than ever. International organizations like the United Nations UN, World Trade Organization (WTO), and World Health Organization (WHO) must be reformed to better reflect the current geopolitical landscape. New frameworks for global cooperation, such as those focused on climate change, cybersecurity, and public health, will need to be established to address the complex challenges of the 21st century. The rise of regional powers, such as China and India, requires new mechanisms for international diplomacy and cooperation, as well as strategies for managing competition in areas like trade, technology, and military power. Social justice and global inequality. Despite significant progress in some areas, inequality remains one of the most persistent challenges of the 21st century. Both within nations and between them, wealth and resources are increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few, while billions of people remain in poverty. Economic inequality and the need for reform as automation, digitalization, and technological innovation change the economic landscape. New models of economic organization will be needed to address disparities. Universal Basic Income (UBI), progressive taxation, and social safety nets could help mitigate the effects of economic inequality and ensure that all people benefit from the wealth created by global markets and technological advances. The struggle for human rights. As nations become more interconnected, human rights issues such as gender inequality, racial discrimination, and refugee crises remain central to the global conversation. Efforts to address these issues through international law, activism, and humanitarian aid will continue to be critical in the fight for social justice. The challenge will be ensuring that the benefits of global progress are shared equitably and that marginalized communities are not left behind. The path forward: unity or division? Looking ahead, the path that humanity takes will depend on our ability to cooperate on the most pressing issues of the 21st century. The question remains, will the world come together to address global challenges, or will national interests, economic competition, and ideological divisions lead to fragmentation and conflict? The need for collective action, from climate change to global health. No country can solve these problems on its own. The world will need to unite in addressing issues that transcend borders and require collective action. The rise of multilateralism, the strengthening of international institutions, and the pursuit of common goals will be essential for creating a sustainable, peaceful, and just world. The future is filled with both opportunities and uncertainties, but one thing is clear: humanity's ability to collaborate and innovate will be the defining factor in shaping the next chapter of history. Shaping the future together. As we move further into the 21st century, humanity faces a crossroads. The technological, political, and social challenges ahead will require us to work together as never before. By harnessing our collective intelligence, creativity, and compassion, we can build a world that is just, sustainable, and capable of supporting future generations. The decisions we make today will shape the future of humanity. Let us choose wisely.